On the last day, Blitz accepted the offer, and several Specters were moved from Anatomy to them. Naturally, the Extractors had already been handed over to Anatomy beforehand. No one knew which Specters were purchased, but Julian told him that 5 Specter cages were moved from Anatomy to Blitz. Most likely, none of these Specters were hatchlings or adolescents. This meant that Blitz must have forked over at least 15 veterans. Nick was not surprised in the least. He had expected this to happen. If you don't cut a veggie cube into bite-sized chunks, they will choke on their own greed, he thought. However, as long as things didn't get any worse, Blitz still had a chance at winning. Julian kept laughing from beside Nick. Nick just looked upwards with an apathetic gaze. Meanwhile, "Why are you that dead set on committing suicide?" An angry shout reverberated throughout the room. "I worked here for over a century. I gave my life for this. And now, you want to destroy it for just a couple of Specters." The other 8 people in the meeting room looked at the furious woman. The one who had just shouted was Arya Light. Naturally, she had voted against accepting the offer. This was the first time Arya Light had raised her voice in a meeting in several decades. Her conduct had always been perfect. But today, that streak ended, and she lost control of her anger for the first time in a long while. And to be fair, how couldn't she? Blitz had just voted to accept the offer of all 5 elders from Anatomy for 10 experts. That was madness. How could these people vote for this? "I know you don't like it," a sickly-looking man with a weak smile said softly from the head of the table, "but the board of directors has already come to a decision. Please, keep in mind that we all own part of Blitz." Arya glared at Wilfred Langley, the CEO of Blitz. Meanwhile, Vernon sat beside the furious Arya, looking at the table with a devastated expression, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Naturally, Vernon had also voted against it. He wasn't a good person, but he also wasn't a dumbass. Giving Anatomy that many experts would most likely result in Blitz's destruction. Vernon owned 20% of Blitz, and Arya owned another 20%. Wilfred Langley owned 30%. The 6 other people in the room were representatives of groups of people who all owned 5% each. Blitz only went through with major decisions if 60% of the company decided to go through with it. And with Arya and Vernon voting against it, but it's still going through. Yes, every single other person in the room had voted for it. Vernon and Arya had noticed that Blitz kept making progressively worse decisions over the past couple of years, but they would have never believed that Blitz would vote for what was essentially suicide. There was no logic behind all of this. Miss Light, a fat and tall man with brown hair and a beard, politely said, "You do not need to worry. Ghosty's lab and Gemini know that they can't accept the offer as well. We have already reached the bottom line of what everyone believes to be safe." The man chuckled a bit. "They shouldn't blame us for eating the second-to-last fruit of the dying tree. We were simply faster. And it also won't be our fault if that tree dies without a sapling. We are not the ones that took the last fruit." The man slowly shook his head in confidence. "They won't dare to eat the last fruit, otherwise their precious tree will die. Normal humans don't choose death, Miss Light." The other 5 normal directors looked just as relaxed and confident as the fat man. No other manufacturer would dare to strengthen Anatomy even more. After all, they wouldn't want to die, right? And just like that, Blitz would gain 5 more elders while not strengthening Ghosty's lab or Gemini. "That's not what's going to happen," Arya shouted. "They know that we are Anatomy's first target. They might prefer us over Anatomy, but if we go through with such reckless and irresponsible decisions, their opinion might change." The fat man laughed like it wasn't a big deal. "Change their opinion? Miss Light, who would willingly put their life into the hands of the Sea King?" he asked. Arya Light glared at the man. Then she looked at all the directors, who just smiled back politely. Lastly, she looked at Wilfred. Wilfred just drank some coffee. Arya gritted her teeth, but instead of raising her voice again, she stormed out of the room. "Silence. I didn't know Miss Light had such a temper," one of the directors said. Vernon looked up from the table and glared at the director. The director just coughed awkwardly and looked away. Some seconds later, Vernon stood up. "I have to deal with some things," he said before leaving the meeting room as well. Meanwhile, about 250 meters below this meeting room, some other people were also meeting. "Blitz has accepted the offer," Ghosty said to Herman Reichert. Herman sighed. Just as expected, their greed knows no bounds. "Silence. Will we join them? Silence. Ghosty just looked out of the window. A couple 100 meters away. Blitz has accepted. What should we do, Mindy? Cindy Wonder, the chief Zephyx Extractor of Gemini, asked. Why are you even asking me, Cindy? Mindy Wonder asked back. We're always of the same opinion. Cindy looked at Mindy for a bit. Then she looked at the table before a grin appeared on her face. Finally, she looked at Mindy again. You know how spiteful I can be, she said. Mindy looked back, and her grin mirrored Cindy's. Aren't we both? Down below. Ha 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 ha, Julian kept laughing. Nick just looked up with disappointed disgust. Maybe he actually still had some hope hidden deep in his heart. Sadly, even if that were true, it would have been extinguished as soon as he saw another 5 Specter cages leaving Anatomy and going towards Gemini. Chapter 460, Control. Ghosty watched as 5 Specter cages came from the floor above him and went past Ghosty's lab to Gemini. He fell into deep thought. His conversation with Mundus from 30 days ago shot through his mind. Ghosty remained silent for a long while. Herman just looked at Ghosty with worry, having already sighed several times within the last couple of minutes. Herman was the CEO of Ghosty's lab, but that was technically only in name. In truth, Herman always deferred to Ghosty when there was a decision to make. After all, this was Ghosty's lab, not Herman's lab. Ghosty's lab was the oldest manufacturer in all of Crimson City, and its longevity was all thanks to Ghosty. Herman would trust in Ghosty's decision. Right now, Ghosty was at a crossroads. Which path should he choose? His mind was telling him to go one way, but his heart was telling him to go another. Ghosty definitely followed his mind far more often than his heart, and yet following his heart still felt great. The smart decision or the dumb one? He thought back to many years ago. The city had looked very different back then. How did the city develop ever since then? Did it get better or did it get worse? Was it good right now? The city had changed a lot over the years, and Ghosty hadn't always been happy about it. Ghosty reached into his uniform and pulled a remote with several buttons out. Herman had never seen this remote before. What's that? He asked. Ghosty looked at the remote for a while. Insurance, he said before putting it back into his uniform. Herman didn't ask for clarification. Ghosty remained silent for several minutes as he just looked out of the window. Ghosty wasn't making a decision that would impact his or his company's survival. No, Ghosty's lab would survive regardless of which side won. He was confident in that fact. Ghosty was deciding on the city's survival. If Blitz won, things would return to how they used to be. Maybe they would get even worse since Blitz wouldn't need to contend with Anatomy anymore. If Anatomy won, it would rule over the city. The common people wouldn't see much change since Anatomy would still need to comply with Aegis basic principles, but all the other manufacturers would be eradicated and their extractors turned into coral people. Well, except for Ghosty's lab, of course. Nevertheless, Ghosty didn't like either option. More time passed, then Ghosty took a deep breath. Herman, he said. Yes, Herman answered and waited. Down below. Ha 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 ha, Julian kept laughing. Nick was not surprised. 6 Specter cages left Anatomy and traveled to Ghosty's lab. Seems like the old man is tired of standing on the sidelines, Julian said. Nick didn't answer. Spite is such a beautiful aspect of you humans, Julian said. Nick still didn't answer. Meanwhile, are they crazy? Do they not realize what they are doing? The fat man in Blitz's meeting room shouted in outrage. First, Gemini took 5 Specters for themselves, and now Ghosty's lab is taking 6 as well. They're dooming us all. Please, not so loud, Wilfred said with a soothing voice. We are still in a meeting, remember. Just because Arya and Vernon left doesn't mean that this meeting is over. The director took a deep breath to calm down. Apologies, he said as he sat back down. Wilfred nodded. Now let's get back to voting. I am for. For. Silence. Everyone looked at the last 2 people. One of them was the fat man, and another one was an older man. Both of them looked extremely nervous. The others looked at them expectantly. The 2 of them looked at each other. Finally, the older man looked at the table in defeat. For, he said. Then everyone focused on the fat man. The fat man gritted his teeth, then slumped into his chair and put his head in his arms. Fine for, he said. Wilfred smiled. Adihedahasa. Julian kept laughing. By now, his laughter had become very loud. Nick just looked with absolute disgust upward. 5 more Specter cages were moving towards Blitz. Nick's expectations of humanity were extremely low to begin with, but he still felt disappointed. "Oh, Nick," Julian said. Nick didn't answer. "Your opinion of humanity is too low," Julian said. "You were the one who taught me," Nick answered. "Is my opinion not in line with yours?" Surprisingly, Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just smirked as he looked upward. "Maybe you're right," Julian said, eliciting 2 raised brows from Nick. Then he turned to look at Nick. "Or maybe I just have access to more information than you." Then Julian chuckled again. Nick didn't ask. He knew that Julian loved gloating and that he would tell Nick anyway. "It seems like I'm not the only one taking advantage of Blitz's scattered ownership," he said. Nick raised an eyebrow, and a moment later, the image of Mundus String shot through his mind. "Are you suggesting that Mundus is having a hand in this?" Nick asked. Julian just chuckled. That was all he needed to hear. Blitz might be the strongest manufacturer with the strongest extractors, but the only strong extractor who had ownership in the company was Arya. The remaining ownership was scattered among 1 specialist, 1 expert, and even normal people. "I've never managed to get my hands on Wilfred," Julian said. "No matter how many times I tried to get him to be my friend, I could never get to him." "This explains why." Nick glanced at Julian. Was he controlled during the meeting in which those decisions were made? Julian chuckled. "That's the genius part, he wasn't." Nick looked at Julian in surprise. "Then how?" "Arya would notice if Mundus controlled Wilfred," Julian said. "Because of that, he had to prepare for this moment for a long time. Most likely, he found a way to secretly get to Wilfred, and over many individual sessions over many years, he managed to control him by making Wilfred's values align with his values. In short, he's controlling without controlling." Julian smiled, "Just like me." Julian chuckled a bit more. "And as for the directors, that's not difficult. The directors just fulfill the desires of the owners they represent. Mundus just needs to control the owners when they tell their directors about what they want." Nick looked upward again. It didn't look good for Blitz. Yet a couple of moments later, Nick noticed something. A person jumped down from the layer with all of the big manufacturers, and by the looks of it, the person was jumping right toward Dark Dream. "Would you look at that?" Julian said. "It's one of my dear friends." Nick narrowed his eyes when he recognized the person. Some seconds later, the person silently landed in front of the 2 of them, gave Julian a short greeting, then turned to Nick. "Silence." The person took a deep breath and approached Nick. Nick didn't say anything. "Can we talk privately? I have something to discuss with you," they asked. Nick's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fine," he said. Nick walked into Dark Dream. Vernon Melfian followed him. Chapter 461, Could You? Nick walked into Dark Dream and went to the 8th floor. When he entered his office, he left the door open so that Vernon could also enter. Vernon walked in after Nick and closed the door behind him before looking at Nick with furrowed brows. Vernon's appearance hadn't changed in any way within the last decade. He still looked like a charismatic 20-year-old. After he closed the door, only 2 people were left in the room, Vernon and Nick. Well, and the couple of mouths representing Julian, but Vernon didn't know that they were there. Naturally, Julian wouldn't let Nick talk alone with Vernon. First of all, he didn't want Vernon to get some stupid ideas and kill Nick as some form of revenge for his dead son. And second, Julian didn't want to risk his secret getting out. Vernon sat down in one of the chairs and looked at Nick. Judging by his expression, he was not happy to be here. "What do you want?" Nick asked evenly. Vernon looked back at Nick. "It's customary to offer a visitor a drink." "What do you want?" Nick asked again. Silence. Vernon sighed like he was disappointed in Nick's lack of mannerisms. "No drink then," Vernon said. Nick didn't say anything and just looked at Vernon. "Let me get right to the point then," Vernon said. "Is there something you can do against anatomy?" Nick's brows furrowed, and the mouths on the walls chuckled. "Me," Nick said with a flat voice. "Do something against anatomy. I'm a peak veteran." "They have 3 heroes and a demon," Nick stated matter-of-factly. "I know that," Vernon said, "so can you do something?" Nick leaned back in his chair in exasperation. "What am I supposed to do against anatomy?" "I don't know," Vernon said with annoyance. "But answer the question. Can you do something against anatomy?" Nick took a deep breath. "What makes you think that I can do something?" Vernon remained silent for a couple of seconds. "You killed Wintour," he said. Nick's eyes shot open with rage, and he wanted to protest, but Vernon just lifted his arm to stop him. "It doesn't matter what you say," Vernon said. "I know what I know. Even if you are not involved, I will still think you are involved." "But that's not why I'm here right now," Vernon added. "I'm here because I foolishly, I might add, believe that there is a chance that there's something you can do. You survived an ambush of 10 equal fighters. I gave you the Shadow Shroud. Not even a couple of hours after giving you the Shadow Shroud, the CEO of the Spartans gets assassinated by a bunch of Specters and someone completely clothed in black. Yes, that one black Specter revealed itself later, but I don't think it was that Specter that did everything. I think it was you. And I also believe that you released the Crimson Sea," Vernon said. "Are you insane?" Nick asked with annoyance. "I was a peak John back then." "Yes," Vernon said, "which is exactly why I believe that you might be able to do something against anatomy." Nick gritted his teeth. "That's not what I meant. The Spartans had 5 veterans and something like 30 Johns. How would a single John even be able to get in there and do all of these things?" "I don't know," Vernon said. "I'm not you." Nick took a deep breath in frustration. "Is this your plan?" Nick asked as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You're trying to frustrate me to death because you believe that I killed Wintour." "No, I'm serious," Vernon said. Nick leaned back in his chair, looking like he had given up. "Vernon, if you genuinely believed all of this, you would have long since reported me to the governor. After all, the Crimson Sea ruined your precious little blood spring that was the Dregs." Surprisingly, Vernon scoffed. "And implicate myself. I gave you the Shadow Shroud. I don't think the governor knows that I gave you the Shadow Shroud, but I'm not taking any risks. If you get convicted of freeing the Crimson Sea, I also get convicted." "But that doesn't matter," Vernon added. "I'm asking whether or not you have a way to deal with anatomy." Nick looked with annoyance at Vernon. "I'm a peak veteran. What am I supposed to do against a company like Anatomy? They have 3 fucking heroes," Nick thought with frustration. "Yes, my abilities are perfect for such a mission, but I only have 2 of them since my 3rd ability is for fleeing, not staying hidden. Even more, all the coral people are mentally connected. That means I can't be suspected by any of them, and I can't kill any of them. If I kill even one, everyone in the entire building will know where I am. On top of that, Anatomy doesn't have light shafts like the Spartans. There's simply no way. I would be found without a doubt," Nick thought. "No, there's nothing I can do," Nick said. Vernon furrowed his brows. "Are you certain?" "Yes, I am," Nick said. Silence. "What if you became an expert and had the choice of any ability for ability advancement?" Vernon asked. Nick fell into thought. An expert, any ability. "What's with these what-if questions?" Nick asked with annoyance. "I just started creating my shell. Even at my speed, that will take me a decade." "Again, you're dodging my question," Vernon said with a calm tone. "If you were an expert, would you be able to do it?" Nick looked with annoyance at Vernon, then fell into thought. With an additional ability and double his current power, would he be able to do something? Sadly, it still seemed almost impossible. However, things went from impossible to almost impossible. Nick shook his head. "I can't get past the heroes." "What if 2 of them are not there, and the last one is busy watching over the Sea King?" Vernon asked. Nick furrowed his brows. Was it possible? There were still the coral people, and Anatomy still had 5 specialists. "What does it matter?" Nick said with a disregarding tone as he leaned back in his chair. "I'm not an expert, and I won't be for a long while." Vernon looked at Nick. "What if you could get your shell right now?" he asked. Nick looked with skepticism at Vernon. Chapter 462, Elixir. Get a shell by today. How would that even be possible? A shell was the very thing that turned veterans into experts. After a veteran became a peak veteran, they needed to reach the top of their level first, which usually took a couple of years. Naturally, Nick had already accomplished that, but then came the difficult part. Just like when Johns became veterans, when veterans became experts, they also needed to achieve something special. For becoming a veteran, it was Zephyx. For becoming an expert, it was condensing one's shell. What was a shell? A barrier or energy field made of a special kind of Zephyx. The shell would surround a person's Zephyx synchronizer, speeding up the recovery of Zephyx by over 10 times. Without that, experts would have trouble gathering enough Zephyx to battle. It was still fine for initial experts, but early experts would need days to recover their Zephyx since they barely recovered more than what they were using by just sitting around. As for mid-experts, even that became impossible. Just like a veteran without Zephosis, a mid-expert without a shell would essentially starve, no matter what they did. While condensing the shell after becoming an expert was technically possible, the decreased speed of recovery would make the process over 4 times longer. How long did it take to create a shell? If a peak veteran could fill their body with all the Zephyx they could absorb every single day without missing a single one, it would take about 10 years. That was the fastest speed humanly possible. It was impossible to get any faster. Of course, even though Nick essentially had control over all of Dark Dream, he could only work with the tragedy, and working with the tragedy took him out of commission for 24 hours. Sure, that technically meant that he could fill his body with Zephyx once per day, but that meant not being able to do anything else. If Nick did that, Dark Dream would lose its chief Zephyx Extractor and might collapse. However, there was another source of Zephyx, Julian. Julian was constantly wagering with people, which meant he was growing more powerful and creating Zephyx. His presence in Dark Dream gave everyone inside it quite a boost in how fast they grew, and he was also a big reason why Dark Dream's extractors were growing this quickly. Nick received quite a bit of that Zephyx, but in the end, he still wasn't growing at optimal speeds. All in all, Nick estimated that he would need 12 to 15 years to condense his shell. Sadly, there was no way to get past that. The special Zephyx the shell was made out of was personalized for every extractor. This meant that using outside Zephyx did not work. The body had to create this kind of Zephyx on its own over a long period and by absorbing a crazy amount of Zephyx. So, while the bottleneck to reach the veteran stage was willpower, the bottleneck to reach the expert stage was time and money. Most veterans only reached that stage in their late 30s or 40s, and they reached the peak veteran stage in their early or late 50s. Then, as long as they were not prioritized by their manufacturer for 10 entire years, they would need 30 to 40 years to condense their shell, meaning they would become experts in their 80s or 90s. While veterans could live a couple decades longer than normal people, 90 was still old for them. 90 for a veteran was comparable to 60 for a normal person. By then, many veterans had already died on duty, retired, or switched jobs. Or maybe they had stopped caring about their power and just worked 5 days a week instead of 7, slowing the creation of their shell even more. In the end, the decision of who became an expert was not really up to the extractors but the manufacturers. The manufacturers were the ones that assigned the Specters to the extractors. If they wanted a veteran to advance, they would advance in 10 years. If they didn't care, the veteran would need several decades, or never advance at all. But no matter what decision the manufacturer made, it couldn't just create an expert instantaneously. Or could they? Are you suggesting that there is a way? Nick asked with a raised brow. At that moment, the mouths on the walls were chuckling. If he's offering you the elixir, he must really believe he's going to die, the mouth said with mirth. Naturally, Vernon didn't hear them. Nick didn't show any outward reactions, but he was surprised deep inside. The elixir, so there is a way, Nick thought. Vernon took a deep breath and nodded. He just uses the cities as factories for Zephyx, he explained, and they secure the loyalty of their strongest followers with valuable treasures. One of these treasures is the elixir, and Aegis only exchanges it for several tons of Zephyx. Tons? Nick blurted out in shock. Vernon nodded. Several tons, he repeated. 1 ton was around 1 billion credits, and Vernon said that Aegis wanted several for this elixir. And what can this elixir do? Nick asked. It can create a shell within minutes, Vernon said. Nick took a deep breath. And you are offering that to me? Only if you are willing to enter a death pact in exchange, Vernon said. The mouths on the wall laughed. A death pact? Nick asked. It's a contract that can't be avoided or broken, only fulfilled, Vernon said. And what would this death pact state? Nick asked. That you will do your best to stop anatomy, and that you won't stop until you are either dead or anatomy has received so much damage that Blitz can at least evenly fight it. If you don't accept the death pact, I will not give you the elixir, Vernon said. Nick furrowed his brows. Chapter 463, The Death Pact. Welcome back, Mr. Melfian, one of the 2 guards in front of Blitz said politely. Vernon just smiled and nodded before walking into Blitz. After entering, Vernon walked through the long hallway until he reached the extractor shafts. He typed a couple of things into the console, entered the shaft, and jumped out after reaching the top floor. Just like with Dark Dream, Blitz's top floor was also only for business meetings and administration. Vernon walked straight to his office and entered. After closing the door behind him, he locked it, making sure nobody would accidentally enter. Vernon's smile vanished and was replaced with a cold frown. He carelessly dumped a briefcase he was carrying on the floor. Snap! The briefcase opened, and a cloud of mist came out. A short moment later, the cloud turned into Nick, who just looked at Vernon. Naturally, Vernon did not want to show his hand to the other members of Blitz. He had already suspected that some of the directors were controlled by anatomy before the first vote had even happened today, but he had only been sure after the vote was done. Yes, every human was greedy, but not to such an insane degree. Something else had to be going on. Sadly, there was no way to check or report these things. Checking the directors and owners would warn anatomy and might provoke them into attacking immediately. Reporting sadly didn't work since the governor seemed to always cut anatomy some slack. Most likely, if they reported that anatomy was controlling 60% of Blitz, the governor might just directly argue that Blitz belonged to anatomy now. Of course, that was bullshit, but that didn't matter. The person who made the rules was not bound by said rules, only by their own morals. A parent could enforce a rule of the house on the children, but who could stop the parent if they didn't follow that rule themselves? Because of that, Vernon didn't want anyone to see Nick or find out what he was planning. Vernon went to the back of the room and pushed some furniture aside, revealing a small door at the bottom of the wall. He fidgeted with the door for over half a minute before carefully opening it. Nick didn't look towards Vernon's direction. He didn't want to antagonize Vernon needlessly. When Nick had that thought, he almost laughed bitterly. I'm careful not to antagonize Vernon now, Nick thought. The guy basically knows that I killed Wintour. I don't think there's much I can do about that. Nick just slightly glanced towards Vernon's back. Although he seems more interested in his profit than the death of his son. Eventually, Vernon turned around and put a sheet of metal on top of his table. The big sheet had countless runes of unknown origin carved into it, and Nick could feel incredible amounts of Zephyx inside the material. This was definitely not something cheap. After putting the sheet down, Vernon went to a locked cupboard, opened it, and carefully retrieved something. It was a perfectly white sheet of paper. When Nick saw that paper, his eyebrows rose in surprise. That's not paper, that's pure Zephyx in the shape of paper. Vernon carefully put the paper in the middle of the plate before retrieving an ornate fountain pen. Then he very slowly started to write on the paper with red ink. Nick had to wait for over 20 minutes until Vernon was done writing. Come over and see if this is okay. Don't touch the paper, Vernon said, moving to the side. Nick walked over and looked at the contract. Nick had signed thousands of contracts within his 17 years of being a chief Zephyx Extractor, and he was also very confident in being able to spot shady passages in one. However, the contract seemed to be fine. It stated exactly what they had agreed upon. Nick would try his best to deal enough damage to anatomy to give Blitz a fighting chance. He was not allowed to run away or retreat unless he genuinely believed that this was the best course of action for damaging anatomy and keeping Blitz alive. In exchange, Blitz would give Nick one elixir before the mission started, as well as access to a Specter of his choosing for ability advancement. And if Nick succeeded, Vernon would do his best to give Dark Dream an elder that could be relatively easily worked with. Originally, Nick asked for more since he would basically be saving Blitz's ass, but Vernon wouldn't budge. According to him, the elixir was already worth more than a normal elder. Blitz only invested in one elixir every 3 years on average, and Vernon was already annoyed that he had to give Nick one of them. Looks good, Nick said. Vernon nodded, went back to the paper, and signed at the bottom. Then he held the pen out to Nick without looking at him. Nick grabbed the pen and signed at the bottom of the page. Vernon carefully put the pen away and went to another locked cupboard. Some seconds later, he took out 7 crystals of Zephyx, each about 5 centimeters high and in the shape of a rhombus. Each crystal represented exactly 1 kilo of Zephyx. Vernon put the 7 crystals on round outcroppings of the sheet of metal. Whoom! When he put the last one on it, Nick suddenly felt like some kind of force was suppressing him from all sides. Immediately, some kind of terrifying presence seemed to enter the office, and Nick was forced to look over. The office seemingly vanished, replaced by a portal that led to a dimension of eyes. All of the eyes looked through the portal and focused on Nick and Vernon. A cold shudder ran down Nick's back, and even if he could move, he wouldn't dare to. A moment later, Nick felt like death touched his heart. And then the portal closed, and everything returned to normal. Nick couldn't help taking a deep breath before looking at Vernon, who looked just as exhausted as him. Chapter 464, Getting the Elixir. What was that? Nick couldn't help asking. That was the ocular serpent, a fallen, Vernon answered after a sigh. Nick took a deep breath. A fallen. That was a level 7 Specter. The last level 7 Specter Nick had seen was Envy's avatar. This was a Specter that could destroy Crimson City on its own. So how does this death pact work now? Nick asked. Just try thinking about not going to anatomy or refusing to help us, Vernon said, as he started putting the things away again. Nick did just that, and a short moment after, he felt like some kind of force was slowly constricting his heart. Nick's face immediately became white, and he stopped thinking about reneging on the contract. Slowly, the constricting force lessened. It was almost like a snake that had loosened its hold. That is going to be your death if you think about betraying me, Vernon said. Naturally, the same is true for me. Nick nodded and watched Vernon put the things away. The first thing Nick noticed was that the Zephyx crystals were gone, but he wasn't surprised by that. The 7 kilos of Zephyx had probably been used to summon the ocular serpent to officiate the contract. Gaining power by officiating contracts does not sound reasonable for a Specter, Nick thought. This sounds more neutral, or like a net benefit for humanity, and I've never heard of any Specter like that. Most likely, it gets power by doing crooked promises or something. Nick looked at the ornate sheet of metal that Vernon was putting away. But it's probably suppressed by Aegis, and they probably turned it into a contract enforcer or officiator. And instead of gaining power the normal way, it just takes a couple million credits worth of Zephyx. Makes sense. Vernon finished putting the things away and walked to the side of his office. He lifted the open suitcase and put it on his table. Get in, he said. I don't have access to the elixir, we need to get it. Nick furrowed his brows. You don't have access to it. Isn't that something you should have secured before we signed the death pact? He asked in annoyance. That's not your problem, Vernon said. I'm the one that's going to die if I don't give you the elixir. Nick looked at Vernon for a bit longer before he turned into mist and entered the suitcase. Vernon closed the suitcase and walked out of his office with it. He walked past a couple of doors and knocked on one of them. What? Came an annoyed shout from inside. Vernon just opened the door and stepped inside. He was now inside another office, a bit bigger and more orderly. Beside the big desk at the end of the room stood a beautiful blonde woman who glared at Vernon. However, when she saw who it actually was, she calmed down a bit and looked back at a bunch of papers on her desk. This was Arya Light, and she seemed quite agitated. What is it? Arya asked, not looking up from her desk. Vernon wordlessly approached her. Bang! He slammed the contract he had just signed onto the table. Arya raised her eyebrow at the uncharacteristically rude action and read through the contract in a single second. Her eyes shot open in a mix of shock and fury. Did you also become insane? She shouted. Vernon just neutrally looked at her. It's the best shot we have, he said. How can you consider this a shot? Arya asked in exasperation. That guy is a veteran. Expert soon, Vernon said. Arya narrowed her eyes and glared at Vernon like he had just killed her children. Vernon just looked at her for a couple of seconds before he sighed helplessly. I can't tell you why, but I have faith in him, he said with a defeated voice. Arya's face scrunched up in a mix of disgust and skepticism. Aren't you always going on about how he killed your son? Where did that change come from all of a sudden? That didn't change, Vernon answered. I still think he did it. However, whether that's true or not doesn't matter right now. Blitz and our survival are all that matter, and I can't think of any other way to deal with anatomy. Arya looked at Vernon for a bit before she focused on the contract again. 10 seconds later, she groaned and ruffled her hair in frustration. We're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here, she said before handing the contract back to Vernon. So you're giving me the elixir? He asked. Am I just supposed to let you die like that? Arya answered with a sigh. You probably signed that death pact on purpose before asking me so that I'm forced to give it to you. Vernon didn't confirm nor deny. Arya sighed again. Give me a second. She walked to the back of her office and opened a secret safe. Arya retrieved something and put it on the desk. It was an ocean blue bottle made of crystals. There, she said. Vernon nodded, but instead of approaching the desk again, he just held his briefcase forward. Arya raised an eyebrow. Vernon opened the briefcase, and a cloud of mist left it, which quickly transformed into Nick. When Arya saw Nick, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. She had not sensed him at all. She, an early hero, hadn't sensed the presence of a mere peak veteran. "Hi," Nick said neutrally with a nod at Arya. Arya closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She felt a bit embarrassed about her conduct earlier. She was usually much more composed, and she'd only acted like this because she knew Vernon was the only person here. However, the more she thought about it, the calmer she actually got. The fact that Nick could stay hidden in front of her was shocking. If he could stay hidden in front of her, he should be able to do the same with other heroes. Maybe there was actually a small chance of success. Chapter 465, Rhombus. Nick looked at the fancy blue bottle on the desk before looking at Arya for confirmation. Arya looked at Nick with a skeptical raised brow, but nodded for him to take it a moment later. Nick nodded back and took hold of the bottle. When Arya saw Nick taking the elixir that Kugelblitz had attained after paying a ridiculous sum of money, she could only sigh. What had happened to Kugelblitz? They used to be the strongest in the city, uncontested, and now they entrusted their fate to a mere peak veteran from some upstart manufacturer. As Arya thought about the two devastating votes from a couple of hours ago, she couldn't help but sigh again. Kugelblitz had really gone to shit. Arya still remembered the first time she had seen Nick. That had been during the first big meeting of manufacturers. Back then, Nick was only a new John, and he seemed extremely insecure. She had viewed him as an amusing child instead of competition. But now, things were different. Nick was being entrusted with Kugelblitz's safety, and he definitely didn't seem insecure anymore. In fact, he seemed quite capable and confident while standing in the same room with two people much more powerful than him. He had changed a lot. "How do I use this?" Nick asked. "Just drink it and focus on your Zephyx synchronizer," Arya explained. "Then just try to build your barrier. It's that simple." Nick nodded, looked at the bottle and opened it. A blue mist came out of the top of the bottle and vanished into the air. Nick narrowed his eyes and drank from the bottle. The liquid felt extremely hot, but for some reason, Nick didn't feel like he was getting injured by it. It was like pain without the injury, kind of like what the nightmare did. Nick drank the entire bottle and closed his eyes. Then he focused on his Zephyx synchronizer. After a couple of seconds, he felt a blue wave of energy traveling from his stomach into his neck, and he could feel how the blue energy wrapped around his Zephyx synchronizer. Nick visualized a spinning rhombus as his Zephyx synchronizer, and he almost felt like he could see inside himself. Above the spinning rhombus was a violently burning ball of fire. It looked like it could explode at any moment, but it never did. That was the foreign Zephyx Simon Francium had put in Nick's body. Nick also noticed that his surroundings were wrapped in a blue mist. "This is the elixir," Nick thought as he narrowed his eyes at the mist. Then he opened his arms and moved them towards his Zephyx synchronizer. The blue mist warped and traveled closer to the spinning rhombus. A bit of it touched the rhombus, and Nick felt like he was about to reach the expert stage. "No," Nick thought, suppressing the breakthrough. The rhombus spat out the blue mist again and returned to normal. Over the next couple of minutes, Nick focused on creating a barrier around his Zephyx synchronizer. After a while, the mist turned into a ball, but it was still hazy. Nick willed the hazy ball to compress. It slowly started to shrink, becoming cloudier and cloudier, but about a minute later the cloudiness vanished, replaced by transparency. Nick pushed the inside of the ball more toward the outside while keeping the outside at its current position. He started to feel pain radiating from his neck, but he ignored it and kept going. The transparent ball began to shake, but Nick just kept compressing it. Crack! A crack appeared in the glass, but Nick repaired it. Crack, crack, crack. More and more cracks appeared, but Nick repaired them instantly. Sweat streamed down his face, but he remained focused and calm. The cracks grew more numerous, appearing and vanishing. Suddenly, Nick opened his eyes widely with intensity, and the glass began to shine brightly. He kept focusing on it, and a couple of seconds later, it vanished. A hair-thin transparent barrier had appeared around Nick's Zephyx synchronizer. However, it was not in the shape of a ball. Every shell was in the shape of a ball, but Nick's wasn't. The reason they were in the shape of a ball was to minimize surface area. The smaller the shell, the higher its density and the more Zephyx it attracted. However, the shell wasn't allowed to touch the Zephyx synchronizer, or it might break. Because of that, everyone just created a ball around it. Nick had done something else. The cracks that had appeared earlier had been his shell touching his Zephyx synchronizer. Usually, that little stunt would cost an extractor weeks or months of gathering Zephyx, which was why they didn't dare get too close. Sure, if they knew the shape of their Zephyx synchronizer, they could make a smaller and better barrier, but doing it this way wouldn't help. They could only create one crack every few months, and by the next attempt they would have forgotten the exact spot. It wasn't worth it. However, the elixir gave Nick enough Zephyx to work with, and he decided to make use of all of it. Nick looked with intensity at the spinning rhombus in front of him. There was no shell. However, the rhombus shone with a slight blue light. Actually, there was a shell, but it perfectly adhered to the rhombus. The two were touching, but so lightly that neither was damaged. When Nick saw that he had succeeded, he took a deep breath. Whoom! Then he felt a terrifying storm of Zephyx rushing past him and entering the rhombus. The storm continued and never stopped. This was how much Zephyx Nick was now absorbing passively. That must be over 20 times faster than before, Nick thought in shock. Chapter 466, Taking a Risk. Over 20 times, Nick thought as he took a deep breath. A normal shell is supposed to increase Zephyx recovery by only about 10 times. Has anyone done this before? Nick thought. He thought about how he would have done it without the elixir. Without the elixir, I would have never done things like this. I would have just made a ball like everyone else. Faster Zephyx recovery isn't worth spending another 20 years as a peak veteran. I simply don't have the time. Additionally, my goal isn't necessarily to become the most powerful person in the world. Sure, that would help, but my goal takes priority. Nick thought about all the poor people living in the outer city, and he felt his blood starting to boil. Then he thought about the governor, which didn't calm him down. After that, Blitz shot through his mind, and he imagined the crimson fungus bathing in the blood of the poor. Finally, anatomy shot through his mind. Nick wasn't sure if the lives of normal people would improve or deteriorate if anatomy came to power. Sure, the lives of the extractors would become worse, but extractors weren't normal people. But that doesn't matter now, Nick thought with narrowed eyes. I'm already in the same boat as Blitz, and I need to uphold my side of the bargain. Nick took another deep breath and opened his eyes. Arya and Vernon looked at him with expectation. Did it work? Vernon asked. Nick nodded. Yes, I have my shell. Vernon sighed in relief. The most dangerous part of the advancement was over. Now Nick only needed a new ability, and he could advance. Good, Vernon said before looking at Arya. Arya looked at Nick neutrally. What ability do you want? Naturally, Arya was more experienced when it came to Blitz's Specters and their abilities. Nick already knew what ability he wanted, but he stopped himself, furrowing his brows. Arya raised an eyebrow. Nick fell silent and looked at the ground. I'm not sure if anyone has created this kind of shell, he thought. Everyone says you should make a round one, but that doesn't seem to be the best way forward. This means there might still be room for optimization when it comes to becoming stronger. And I managed to find one of these ways. Of course, if others had access to the elixir, they might have managed it too, but I haven't heard of anyone who did. So, since I found one way to further optimize my path forward, isn't there a possibility there might be another? Julian is already growing extremely quickly, and I'm certain he will try to kill me before I become a specialist. I need every bit of extra power I can get without taking too long to get it. Nick took a deep breath. I can't believe I'm actually about to do this. I know I'll hate myself in a couple of minutes. Then he looked at Arya. Is there a way to rescue me if I get swallowed by the fiend of darkness? Nick asked. Vernon's eyes widened, and Arya's eyebrows rose in surprise. Silence. You want to get swallowed by the fiend of darkness? Arya asked in surprise. Nick nodded. Why? She asked. I've met the nightmare many times in my life, Nick said, and I believe I can resist it for quite a while. I want to see if it's possible to get the nightmare's ability via the fiend of darkness. Vernon and Arya calmed down. Not possible, Arya said. We already tried that. Let me try anyway, Nick said. Arya looked a bit annoyed. If that's what he wants, Vernon said, we have to oblige. It's part of the death pact. Arya sighed and rolled her eyes. This seemed like an unnecessary risk. The fiend of darkness had killed extractors before. It was not easy to work with, and getting swallowed by it was especially dangerous. Yes, there's a way to get you out, Arya said. Is that what you want? Nick nodded. Fine, Arya said. I can't stop you without killing Vernon. Then she took hold of Vernon's suitcase and pointed it at Nick. Get in, I'll get you there, she said. Nick turned into mist and went into the suitcase without even looking at Vernon. Vernon just sighed, and here he had thought the most dangerous part of the advancement was already over. Now Nick wanted to get swallowed by the fiend of darkness. That was ridiculous. Arya looked at Vernon, a small, helpless expression on her face. Vernon just shrugged. Arya sighed silently. Then a serious, confident expression appeared on her face, and she walked out of her office. Demeanor and appearance were important for a CZE. The reason she had put Nick in the suitcase was to keep him a secret. It was important that no one saw him. Dark Dream was one of Blitz's competitors, and Nick wasn't very close to anyone from Blitz. Seeing him walking around with Arya during such a tense situation would elicit suspicion. Arya walked past a couple of employees and went down a couple of floors, moving her hand over an inconspicuous part of the wall as she continued down the hallway. Naturally, these hallways were highly secure, and anyone who didn't know what to look out for would trigger an alarm. Arya approached a door and moved her hand over a console beside it. The door opened, and she stepped into a locker room with different uniforms and tools. The door closed behind her, and she opened the briefcase. Nick came out of the briefcase and returned to his normal state. "We're here," Arya said as she went to one of the walls and grabbed something. The thing she grabbed looked like a harpoon with a long white rope attached to it. "Is that what we're going to use to get me out?" Nick asked. Arya nodded. Chapter 467, The Fiend of Darkness. "How is this going to work?" Nick asked. "I'll show you," Arya said as she approached one of the doors with the harpoon slung over her shoulder. Nick followed her and watched her open the door. As soon as it opened, Nick saw only pure darkness. Bang! Arya shoved her hand forward and the darkness was pushed back, revealing a well-lit room. In the distance, Nick could now see a black cloak pinned against one of the walls. When he saw that, he realized what had happened. The room hadn't been dark. It had been the cloak pressing itself against the employee entrance, making the room seem dark. Nick imagined the floating black cloak waiting in front of the entrance to ambush anyone foolish enough to enter. The cloak was over 3 meters long, with 2 sleeves each 2 meters long. On its top was a black hood with surprisingly normal proportions. Naturally, nobody was wearing it. As Nick looked into the cloak, he felt like he was looking at the blackest thing that existed. It seemed to contain an eternity of darkness, and in a way, that was right. Any person who touched the Fiend of Darkness would vanish, and the Fiend of Darkness did not grow when that happened. This meant it most likely wasn't containing the person inside itself. Instead, it probably transported them somewhere. In a way, the Fiend of Darkness was essentially a very fast and aggressive portal, and touching it meant death. Fighting it was very different from fighting normal Specters. "It doesn't have intelligence and always attacks the Extractors," Arya said. "I have to stay here to contain it." Arya kept pointing her hand at the Fiend of Darkness, pushed against the wall. "It's important to keep it pinned in one spot. If it moves even a little, you won't be able to get back," she said. "How come?" Nick asked. "We're not entirely sure where the Fiend of Darkness leads, since it's impossible to perceive your surroundings inside. But we know the entrance point moves when the Fiend of Darkness moves," Arya explained. Nick understood what she meant. One only needed to imagine 2 portals in 2 different locations. If one moved left, the other might move right. If one moved up, the other might move down. The way the Fiend of Darkness actually stopped people from escaping was by pushing them through the portal, then moving the portal away. Since the portal and its surroundings were the darkest black, it was impossible to sense it from the other side. Once someone lost the location of the portal, it was impossible to find again. The next moment, Arya took hold of the harpoon and readied it. Bang! She threw it at the Fiend of Darkness, the rope rapidly gliding through her fingers. The harpoon vanished into the darkness. "Siararar." Arya clenched her fingers, and the rope stopped moving. Then she slowly let go, and it surprisingly continued going into the Fiend of Darkness. It looked almost like the Fiend of Darkness was pulling the rope in. "The orientation inside it is different," Arya explained as she slowly fed the harpoon more rope. "If it's pinned against the wall like this, it's pointing downward in the other location. It's not pulling on the rope. Gravity is." Nick nodded in understanding and waited. A moment later, Arya raised an eyebrow and pulled a bit on the rope. After moving it back and forth, she nodded. "It's touching the bottom," she said, looking at Nick. "You can go in now, but keep one thing in mind. You can only come back by either climbing up the rope or holding onto it and pulling, in which case I'll pull you out. Even though the rope is white, You won't be able to see it inside, since any light immediately vanishes. This means you have to keep hold of it the entire time. If you let go, you won't be able to find it again under the nightmare's influence. Do you understand? She asked. Nick looked at the Fiend of Darkness and nodded. Good, Arya said. How long should I wait until I can be sure you're dead? Nick furrowed his brows. 6 hours, he said. Arya rolled her eyes. 6 hours. It would be surprising if anyone survived 6 minutes under the nightmare's indescribable torture. The darker it was, the stronger the nightmare's influence, and the area behind the Fiend of Darkness was probably the darkest place in the world. If it's that long, there's another thing I have to tell you, Arya said. Nick raised an eyebrow. There's no oxygen in there. If you plan to be in there for hours, you'd better take a deep breath, she said. Nick furrowed his brows. Experts didn't need air, but he wasn't an expert yet. Nevertheless, holding his breath for 6 hours wasn't that difficult since the vast majority of his bodily functions worked by using Zephyx. His body barely needed any oxygen. All right, Nick said. Then you can enter whenever you want. I'll wait here. Just pull on the rope 3 times in quick succession and I'll pull you out, Arya said. Nick nodded again and focused on the Fiend of Darkness. He grabbed the rope Arya was holding and approached it, keeping the rope inside his hand. When he reached the Fiend of Darkness, he stopped and breathed deeply a couple of times. He knew what was waiting for him in there. He knew the next minutes would be the worst of his life. For a minute, he just waited in front of it. Then he gritted his teeth and jumped in. Chapter 468, Deepest Darkness. Nick entered the Fiend of Darkness while holding the rope. The first thing he felt was that he was suddenly being pulled forward, and he used the rope to realign himself with gravity's new direction. The next thing he felt was the familiar pain of being under the nightmare's influence. Since Nick had his eyes closed, he couldn't see what was happening to him. He could only feel it. He felt something sharp and burning entering his chest. He felt his muscles being pulled from his bones. He felt acid encompassing his body. The nightmare's creativity was immeasurable, and it often combined different tortures. Nick gritted his teeth and did his best not to release the breath he was holding. But it was difficult, so very difficult. The pain was just so bad. This was the worst pain someone could imagine, and it happened to him endlessly. It was a pain that could only exist when someone was being killed, but Nick just didn't stop existing. It was difficult to focus on the rope in his hand. When he had been swimming in the sewers many years ago, he hadn't been able to orient himself under the nightmare's influence, but after years of experience, he had become pretty good at it. The pain was unbearable, but he could still feel where he was. Bang! Finally, Nick felt his body collide with something hard, and he knew he had hit the bottom. He knew this was not an illusion since the force didn't hurt that much. The next moment, Nick felt like the left side of his ribcage had collapsed as something incredibly hard hit him there. He felt himself flung into the distance before getting impaled by spikes. His entire body was covered in sweat, and he tried his best not to fall into panic. This attack had felt so incredibly real. He felt like someone had just kicked him into the distance. It's not real, no matter how real it feels, Nick told himself as he tried to move while impaled. He could still feel the subtle tug of the rope. He moved his hand downward a bit and felt the metallic feeling of the harpoon. Yes, he had reached the bottom. At that moment, burning spikes poked through his eyelids and entered his eyes. For just an instant, Nick had been able to see them, which terrified him. It's not real, Nick thought as he gritted his teeth so hard that blood flowed out. But it was so difficult to tell his emotions that none of this was real. The nightmare's illusions had never felt so real before. You killed me. The hate-filled scream of a little boy echoed in Nick's ears. Even though it had been many years, Nick still remembered Horyua's voice. I know, Nick thought with gritted teeth as many human teeth bit into his shoulder. I'll repay my debt to you. Nick tried his best to remain calm, and a moment later, he focused on his Zephyx synchronizer. Sadly, that was almost impossible since he was assaulted by pain every single moment. He could only feel his Zephyx synchronizer in small gaps between rapid explosions of pain, like trying to see a part of the sun through thick clouds of smoke. Outside, in the Fiend of Darkness containment unit, a huge amount of Zephyx was produced. The Fiend of Darkness kept producing Zephyx while somebody was inside it. Arya technically didn't need to ask how long Nick wanted to stay, since she only needed to feel the Zephyx in the surroundings, but she wanted to be sure. What if the Fiend of Darkness actually had a maximum amount of Zephyx it could produce in a day, and she prematurely pulled the harpoon out while Nick was still alive? Over 30 seconds had passed, and Arya raised an eyebrow. Surviving 30 seconds under such torture was already impressive. She could tell Nick was still alive since she felt subtle vibrations on the rope. Most humans would fall unconscious when assaulted with so much pain. However, the nightmare kept assaulting the mind while it was unconscious. But since the person didn't feel that much while unconscious, it would take quite a while for them to die. Inside the domain of darkness, Nick kept looking at his Zephyx synchronizer. From time to time he could feel it. It wasn't changing. It was the same as always. This meant he was not close enough to any Specter to absorb their ability. If it were possible to get the Nightmare's ability, he would be able to see at least a subtle change in his Zephyx synchronizer. But there wasn't any. This meant Nick couldn't get the Nightmare's ability here. When Nick saw that, he gritted his teeth even harder. Even though he had expected this, he was still scared and frustrated. If it were that easy to get the Nightmare's ability, people would have already attained it. Arya had said the Fiend of Darkness couldn't give it, and Kugelblitz had probably invested tens if not hundreds of millions of credits researching it. Powerful extractors had probably been here for several minutes, if not hours, after years of preparation. He wouldn't be able to get the Nightmare's ability here. Nick resisted the urge to take in a deep breath and stood up, still holding the rope. Then he opened his eyes. An endless sea of hate-filled grimaces assaulted him. He was drowning in an eternity of endless hatred. The grimaces tore at him with their teeth, and Nick saw his innards pulled out and consumed. Opening one's eyes while under the Nightmare's influence was a bad idea, since that made it much harder to orient oneself. Nick tried his best to look around. He felt the hatred of the faces deep inside himself. They wanted to make him suffer for all eternity. For several seconds, Nick just felt the hatred, and then he turned to look in a direction. Nick felt like all the hatred originated from that place. Nick's mind was going wild. He wanted to return. He wanted to go back. He couldn't take this anymore. But then, the image of all the people of the Dregs melting in the Crimson Seas, mist shot through his mind. I don't deserve to give up, Nick thought with narrowed eyes. I need to redeem myself. And then he did it. He let go of the rope and walked into the darkness. If I die now, I deserve to die. Chapter 469, Eternity. He had done it. He had let go of his way back. Finding the rope again would prove to be almost impossible. The subtle sensation of touching a rope could barely be felt under the endless assault of torture. Nick took controlled, deliberate steps forward, trusting his sense of balance more than his sight. This was the only way he could hope to find the rope again. He only needed to retrace his steps, but that was easier said than done. If his angle changed in any way, he might completely miss the rope on the way back. In fact, relying on that method was idiotic. The chances of success were minuscule. Nick might as well just run randomly into the darkness. And he knew that. He knew all of it, but he still did it. He took a risk, the biggest risk a human could take. Either he succeeded or died. There was even a possibility that he would succeed and then die. After all, as far as he knew, no one had ever gotten the Nightmare's ability. But that might not be completely accurate. What if someone had gotten the ability but died before anyone else could see it? What if the Nightmare killed anyone who got its ability, like Nurse Alice? That might be possible. However, Nick believed this wasn't the case. Everyone suspected that the Nightmare was not conscious. The reason was that it killed anyone who fell unconscious in the darkness. Most Specters, even weak and dumb ones, tended to keep their food source alive unless they gained power by killing somebody. For example, the Talker let people go once conversation became impossible. The Grey Room let people go before their minds vanished. It was quite obvious that the Nightmare gained power by torturing people, and based on how Specters generally worked, experienced extractors were fairly certain it didn't gain power from actively killing people. But it still did so, even though that reduced its food supply. Usually, people would just believe this was a Specter without any intelligence, but that didn't seem feasible for an Eternal. An Eternal must have had enough time to evolve intelligence, so why was it killing its food? The most likely explanation was that it was unconscious. Maybe it was sleeping. Maybe it was in some kind of trance. Maybe it wasn't paying attention. No matter what, it most likely wasn't conscious of the human suffering under its power. And that was what Nick was betting on. If it wasn't conscious of any human, he might be able to get its ability without it noticing. This was the only hope he had left. If that didn't work, he would die. Nick had known from the beginning that his chances of death were over 99%. However, if he didn't put in even more effort, he wouldn't be able to redeem himself. In his mind, the only way to redeem himself was to do his absolute best to improve the lives of a huge group of people. He had to do so much good that the gratitude of countless people outweighed the hatred of the 2,000 or so he had killed. Otherwise, he wouldn't be any better than the people he despised. Truthfully, right now he knew he wasn't any better, which was why he had to give his best to improve. He was in an indescribably deep moral and emotional debt, and he wanted to do everything in his power to get out of it. That was why he had to become powerful enough to achieve his goal. Nick took a step forward, and countless spears of burning metal shot through his body. I deserve this, Nick thought with gritted teeth. He took another step forward, and felt poisonous gas entering all of his orifices, turning him into liquid from the inside. I deserve this, Nick thought. He took one more step forward, and two huge grindstones ground him into dust. I deserve this. I deserve this. I deserve this. Nick kept walking forward in uniform steps. The only way he could cope with the unimaginable torture was to tell himself he deserved to feel all of it. If he didn't tell himself that, he might have given up. Nick looked into the endless sea of hatred with determined eyes. It overlapped with the hatred of all the killed people from the Dregs inside Nick's mind. Nick felt like the people of the Dregs were taking their revenge. They wanted to make him feel the same pain they felt. They wanted to make him lose the same things they had lost. Nick just stepped forward, and another step. He never stopped walking. An eternity of endless hatred, unstoppable pain. I deserve this. I deserve this. I deserve this. I deserve this. He kept walking forever. Time had long since lost its meaning. The hatred became more and more overwhelming. Nothing made sense anymore. What was his body? Where was his body? What was he? What was his mind? What was his soul? Pain, hatred, and reality turned into a colorless sludge, indiscernible from each other. The illusions of the nightmare had become so abstract that they turned into random colors. Pain turned into colors, colors turned into space, space turned into time, time turned into pain. Forward became later, earlier became less painful, later was red, pain was backward. Nothing made sense anymore. Only one thing was certain, only one. I deserve this. This was the only certainty. He deserved this, and he knew it. This was the only thing he knew. Step by step, deeper in the endless hatred. A step, another step, another step, another step, another step, another step. On and on, for all of eternity. Chapter 470, Endless White. White. Black. Nothing. Silence. This was what Nick felt. Nick had stopped walking. There were no more illusions. There was no more pain. Everything had become silent. Everything around him was perfectly black except for the floor. It was perfectly white. Silence, everything was silent. Nothing moved. Nick's mind slowly returned. Bang! He collapsed onto the ground. His mind didn't think, it was just there, existing. Nick closed his eyes and released a bria. No. Nick only released a tiny bit of his breath before he stopped, his mind snapping awake. He hadn't known anything about the world just now, but when he had started to release his breath, something inside of him screamed at him. Nick closed his eyes and gathered his thoughts. It stopped, he thought. Everything has stopped. I'm not dead, or I wouldn't have been so afraid of releasing my breath. Yet there are no more illusions and no more pain. So where am I? Nick slowly stood up, his journey from just now fading from his mind. It was almost like one of the dreamer's dreams. It was like none of this had been real. It was like he hadn't gone through any of it. For how long did I walk? Nick thought. He had no idea. It could have been a minute. It could have been several hours. The only thing that gave him a clue was the air in his lungs. If he had been in here for longer than 12 hours or so, he would feel the need to take a breath. However, he didn't feel that need. A moment later, Nick looked around. The white of the ground seemed unnatural. Everything was so perfectly smooth and white. Hadn't Arya said there was no light in here? So why was the ground so white, and why could he see it? Nick kneeled down and touched the ground. That was when he felt it, and his eyes opened widely in shock. Zephyx, all of this is Zephyx. Nick looked at the endlessness around him. And it's so incredibly dense and hard. Nick felt like the Zephyx was so dense and hard that just a tiny vial of it would be heavy enough to break all his bones. The amount of Zephyx in this area, millions, billions, trillions of tons. This was probably more Zephyx than all of humanity had access to. I can only think of one thing that can produce that much Zephyx, Nick thought as he looked at the endless white plain. Nobody knew where Nurse Alice was when she wasn't visiting humans. Nobody knew where the mall was. Nobody knew where the null was. Everybody knew where the sun was, but no one could see behind or beside it. And the nightmare. Is this the first time a human has reached an Eternal's domain? Nick thought. Nick silently looked at the endless white plain. It felt so alien. He was in darkness, but he didn't feel any pain. This was a completely alien feeling. Every human in the world associated darkness with pain, like associating searing heat with pain. But now Nick was feeling the darkness without the pain. It was like feeling acid burning his body but not associating that feeling with pain. It was strange. For a while, Nick just looked at the nothingness. The hatred had also vanished, which meant he didn't know where the nightmare was. I've already come this far. There's no reason to turn back now, Nick thought. But instead of walking forward, Nick took off his shoes and left them at the exact spot where he stood. Since he could see them now, he used them as a mark to find his way back. And then he walked forward. I should hurry up. I don't know how long I've already been in here, he thought as he started to run. In an instant, Nick had reached incredible speeds. His ability was active, which meant nobody was looking at him right now. He ran for over 30 seconds and the endless amount of Zephyx just never stopped. But then Nick's eyes narrowed and his heart rate increased. There was something in the distance. It was not very tall, but there was something on the ground. Nick slowed down and approached the object carefully and quietly. The closer he got, the more carefully he walked. The Zephyx in the atmosphere around him grew denser and denser, and Nick almost felt like he was passing through a mire of invisible Zephyx. Eventually, Nick reached the object and looked down. When Nick saw it, all his emotions screamed the same thing. This was the nightmare. This had to be the nightmare. In front of Nick was a decaying corpse. It was of average height, but the decomposition had already turned it thin and dried out. Yet the decomposition didn't seem to continue. The corpse was half decomposed, showing parts of its muscles and organs, but there was nothing else. There was no smell. There were no insects. It was like a corpse frozen in time. Even though he stood directly beside it, Nick's ability was still active. He had no idea if this corpse was alive or not. However, his soul was telling him this was the nightmare. Was this why it killed everyone in the darkness? Was it like a corpse filled with highly toxic poison that killed anyone who came too close? It was dead, but its power still covered the world. Nick looked at the endless Zephyx around him. If it's dead, it wouldn't produce this much Zephyx. Although, what if it isn't producing Zephyx? What if this Zephyx was already here, and the corpse is actually converting it into suffering? Nick raised an eyebrow. That wouldn't make much sense. Nick looked at the corpse for a while, and as he did, his Zephyx synchronizer was changing. He was gaining the nightmare's ability. Chapter 471, Vision. It still felt so strange. Nick was looking at the nightmare. He was actually looking at the nightmare's real body. Had any human seen it before? This was an eternal, something that could end all of humanity if it wanted, and yet Nick could just stand here looking at it. The fact that his ability was still active meant the nightmare either couldn't or didn't perceive him. Either it wasn't paying attention to him, or it was unable to pay attention to anything. Was the nightmare truly only a corpse, something that didn't even have a will? But then where did all this endless hatred come from? After all, the nightmare's illusions were filled with the purest hatred imaginable. It was like the nightmare wanted to cause as much suffering in the world as possible. Yet could a corpse even have such feelings? Nick looked away from the corpse and closed his eyes. Then he focused on his Zephyx synchronizer. When he saw that it was changing, his heart rate spiked. There have been people with the ability of an Eternal before, but has there ever been anyone with the abilities of two Eternals? Nick thought. Maybe someone got one from the Maw after getting one from the Sun or the Null, but I can't be sure. Nick opened his eyes again and looked at the corpse. After arriving here, I don't think anyone has ever gotten the ability of the nightmare. Sadly, I can't find out what ability it would give to new Extractors. I barely managed to get here on my own, and I don't think I can pull someone with me. But that doesn't matter now. I should focus on my ability advancement. Nick closed his eyes again and focused on his Zephyx synchronizer. A couple of minutes passed, and then Nick felt his Zephyx synchronizer stop changing. I can feel it, Nick thought. Nick opened his eyes again and looked away. Then he focused on a random spot and made his Zephyx move. Nick's Zephyx rapidly drained and vanished into nothing. Based on the nightmare's powers, Nick had a good guess as to what ability he had unlocked. However, since it has to be connected to my main ability, this probably means it must be related to perception as well. I should test it on Arya later since she probably wants to make sure I didn't manage to get the nightmare's ability. Nick looked in the direction he had come from. Then he glanced a last time at the nightmare. The corpse was just lying there in silence. It was like time didn't exist here. He wondered what the corpse's background was. Was it just how the Specter looked or an actual corpse? In the end, Nick just shook his head and ran towards where his shoes were. He arrived quickly and put them back on. The white endlessness of Zephyx ended at this spot and was replaced by an infinite darkness. The nightmare's influence didn't touch this area, but as soon as Nick stepped into the darkness, it would return. I only have to return, Nick thought. Nick prepared himself mentally, then stepped into the darkness. Nothing, silence. Nick was inside the darkness, but nothing was happening. No pain, no illusions. Nick opened his eyes again and looked around. Everything was black. Even the area behind him was black, even though there had just been the endless white. That was when Nick saw it. In the distance was a thin white line. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. If his guess was right, since there were no illusions, Nick decided to run forward. Earlier, when he had traveled through the darkness to the nightmare, he had walked very slowly, one step at a time. This meant the rope wasn't actually that far away. From what Nick could see, it was maybe 2 or 3 kilometers off. Nick reached the white line in a minute and stopped in front of it. Sure enough, this was the rope. Nick furrowed his brows. Is the influence of the nightmare no longer working on me? Nick turned to look in the direction of the nightmare. It has no intelligence and no will. Therefore, it probably also has no way to see that its power isn't working on me. Nick lifted his right arm and looked at it. Earlier, it had been impossible for him to see anything down here except torture, but now he could also see his hand easily. My arm isn't shining with light like the rope, so how can I see it? Can I actually perfectly see in the dark now? Nick couldn't be sure. Or all of this is just one of the nightmare's tricks, and I actually ran in a random direction. Yet even though this possibility was terrifying, Nick didn't feel like it was true. He didn't feel any danger. Nick slowly grabbed the rope. Then he gritted his teeth and bit a chunk of his left hand off. It hurt a lot, but he wanted to seem desperate. Finally, he rapidly tugged on the rope a couple of times. Crack! The harpoon loosened, and the rope started to ascend while Nick kept hold of it. Nick looked upward and saw a black wall rapidly approaching. Then he looked one last time toward the nightmare. It was still difficult for him to believe he had seen it. Finally, Nick shook his head and gritted his teeth before vanishing into the darkness together with the harpoon. The world had returned to perfect darkness. Nothing was living here. Nothing was happening here. And yet, just a couple of kilometers away was a land of perfect white upon which a rotting corpse lay. It just lay there, forever, unchanging, on the perfect white surrounded by the perfect black, in silence. Chapter 472, Expert. Bang! The harpoon was pulled out of the fiend of darkness, and Nick fell to the ground inside the containment unit. Arya looked at him with shock and interest, but Nick just lay on the ground. Everything okay? Arya asked. Nick released a deep breath and took another. For 5 seconds he didn't say anything. Then he slowly stood up, his steps uncertain. He seemed genuinely shaken. Of course, it wasn't difficult for Nick to act like this. He just needed to remember what he had gone through in there. The journey towards the nightmare had filled him with genuine madness. Back then, he had turned into something he couldn't recognize. He had been a machine, essentially. Remembering that moment filled Nick with dread. It was like he had completely lost himself. I'm fine, Nick said after a while. How long was I in there? 3.5 hours, Arya said with surprise. I've only seen one person survive that long in there, and that person had trained for years before entering. Just as expected, Nick thought. Did you get your ability? Arya asked. Nick slowly shook his head. I tried to get close to the nightmare on a mental level since walking away from the harpoon would be suicide. I believed it would be possible to attain some kind of connection to it that way. Nick sighed, but alas. Arya nodded. If it were possible, we would have already found a way. Yet I am genuinely surprised at how long you managed to hold out in there, and to think you're only a veteran. I guess there's a reason Dark Dream didn't collapse yet. Arya didn't just say these things lightly. She wasn't even sure she could survive that long under the nightmare's influence herself. Resisting the worst torture imaginable for a couple of hours without losing consciousness spoke volumes of Nick's mental stability and willpower. What about your ability? Arya asked. I think I'll take the Fiend of Darkness. It's a good fit for me, Nick said. Arya furrowed her brows. She wouldn't have an issue with that if their relationship with Nick didn't need to be kept secret. However, since she couldn't announce that Nick was here, she needed to work with the Fiend of Darkness herself to produce Zephyx for him. Naturally, she didn't look forward to it. Nevertheless, Arya had been an extractor for over 100 years, and she was used to working with horrible specters. "How long do you need for your Zephyx synchronizer to advance?" she asked. "Since the Fiend of Darkness is a fanatic, it shouldn't take that long. I believe 2 minutes is more than enough," Nick said. 2 minutes, huh? Arya repeated as she looked at the Fiend of Darkness. For a while she remained silent, then she pointed her fingers at it. Bang, bang, bang. Several spikes of light shot into the Fiend of Darkness, and they surprisingly didn't vanish as soon as they touched it. Instead, they pinned it to the wall. "Just sit down in the middle of the room and focus on your advancement. Do not do anything stupid," Arya said with a threatening voice. Nick understood what she meant and nodded. "I understand, thank you." Nick sat down in the middle of the room and turned to the Fiend of Darkness. "You can begin," he said. Arya took a deep breath. Heroes obviously didn't need to breathe, but taking a deep breath still helped calm her mind. Being under the nightmare's influence for 2 minutes was a lot, even for her. The next moment, she jumped into the Fiend of Darkness. Compared to Nick, she didn't need a harpoon, she could just hover at the edge since she could fly. As long as she was inside, the Fiend of Darkness would produce Zephyx. It didn't matter if she was a kilometer away from it or just 10 centimeters. She had warned Nick not to do anything stupid, but that was for his safety, not hers. Since she was hovering just beside the Fiend of Darkness' other exit, she could feel if it moved, and with her superior speed, she'd be able to jump back immediately. However, the Fiend of Darkness would naturally immediately capture and consume Nick, dumping him in a random location somewhere in the darkness. Arya wouldn't be able to get him back if that happened. Of course, her warning actually wasn't necessary, since Nick didn't plan on doing anything stupid anyway. The Fiend of Darkness produced a significant amount of Zephyx, and Nick absorbed as much of it as he could. Of course, since his Zephyx synchronizer had already mutated, it couldn't mutate again in the near future, but he still wanted to absorb as much Zephyx as possible to advance. Additionally, if Arya noticed he hadn't absorbed any Zephyx, she might grow suspicious. While the Zephyx poured into the room, Nick focused on the shell of his Zephyx synchronizer and pulled as much Zephyx into it as possible. In his mental image, the rhombus sped up more and more, and Nick felt his muscles starting to strain and tremble. He was absorbing more Zephyx than his body could handle, that was, if he remained a peak veteran. As Nick absorbed more Zephyx, he felt some sort of barrier shackling his body. He focused on it and used all his willpower to push through. Bang! It was like some kind of barrier broke, and Nick felt endless amounts of Zephyx flowing into his body. His surroundings became clearer, but at the same time, there seemed to be some kind of white sheen to them. It was a contradicting feeling, like two pictures overlapping. One an extremely clear picture of the world around him, the other the Zephyx in the surroundings. Nick's senses had improved a lot, and he could also see Zephyx much better now. But most importantly, he had finally done it. He had now reached the level Albert had been at when Nick met him for the first time. Nick was an expert. Chapter 473, Streak of Black. As an expert, Nick's body was now 1,000 times more powerful than an identical body of a normal human. However, since Nick's build was already very athletic, it was actually about 3,000 times as powerful as the average person's body. And if his ability was active, that went up to 15,000 times. As long as Nick wasn't being perceived, his body was as powerful as an initial or early specialist's. That was insane. Of course, if someone managed to perceive Nick, he would be in huge trouble since all that power would vanish. Sadly, achieving such insane power was only possible with trade-offs. Someone with no weaknesses could become a good fighter, but that was it. If one wanted to be a great or even the strongest fighter, one needed to focus on one's advantages and improve them even more. Someone with great attacking power, great defense, great speed, and great technique could fight almost anyone, but only almost. Someone with peerless attacking power, poor defense, okay speed, and poor technique could casually annihilate the previous fighter. Someone with peerless defense didn't need to fear anyone. Someone with peerless speed couldn't be touched. Someone with peerless technique couldn't be killed. Of course, all of this was only true when these four peerless fighters didn't fight each other. As long as Nick wasn't perceived, he could annihilate a late expert with a single strike, one that would completely destroy their barrier and kill them. Killing someone 3 levels above oneself in one instant was unheard of. But to achieve that power, Nick had needed to completely specialize on that path. He had amazing strengths, but also devastating weaknesses. Yet as long as the opponent didn't get a chance to take advantage of them, they might as well not exist. Nick remained seated in the middle of the room for a while longer. Finally, about half a minute later, Arya jumped out of the Fiend of Darkness. Her face was white, and she seemed quite distressed, but she quickly recovered. Nick looked at her and nodded. "Thank you, everything has worked out." Arya took a deep breath. Being under the nightmare's influence for 2 minutes was still brutal for her. "You've also advanced?" she asked. Nick nodded. "Good," Arya said. Then she looked at Nick for a second. "Did you get your ability?" she asked in a strange voice. A small glimmer appeared in Nick's eyes. Just as expected, he thought. "I did," he said, in a tone that showed he understood the hidden message. "If you turn around for a moment, I can show you." Naturally, showing a stranger one's ability was stupid and a no-go. Even asking someone to show their ability was seen as overbearing and rude. However, that didn't matter right now. The current dynamic between Nick and Arya was not simple. Nick had stayed for hours inside the Fiend of Darkness, and even though the chances were minuscule, maybe, just maybe, he'd managed to get the Nightmare's ability. Obviously, the ability of an Eternal was more important than basically anything, even more important than Vernon's life. On top of that, they had given Nick the elixir, allowed him to get the ability of one of their fanatics, and Arya had even gone through 2 minutes of brutal torture for him. Death pact or not, Arya wanted to confirm Nick's ability. The fairness or rudeness of the matter wasn't important. Naturally, Nick knew all of this, and he had already made preparations. "Okay," Arya said with interest as she turned away from Nick. She wasn't worried about him suddenly attacking her. Nick quietly stood in the middle of the room, but even though Arya wasn't looking at him, his ability didn't reactivate. However, that technically wasn't important for his new ability. It could be used on someone who wasn't perceiving him. It didn't need his ability to be active. At first glance, these two things sounded identical, but they weren't. It was identical when there were only 2 people in a room, but not when there were more. Right now, Nick's ability was deactivated because the Fiend of Darkness could still perceive him. In one case, he wouldn't be able to use his new ability at all. In the other, he'd be able to use it on Arya but not on the Fiend of Darkness. That was the difference. As Nick looked at Arya's back, a small gleam appeared in his eyes. "She can still perceive me somehow," he realized. He could feel that he couldn't use his new ability on her. "But I just need a small moment." "Xing." Nick turned into mist, then he used his new ability. "Wum." A streak of darkness passed through Arya's vision, and Nick turned back into his corporeal form. Nick was certain Arya had still been able to perceive him through smell or the quiet sound of his blood flowing through his veins. Someone as powerful as her must have terrifying senses. But after he turned into fog, all of that vanished, and for just a moment she hadn't been able to perceive him, giving him a small window for his new ability to work. Of course, if she had been looking at him, this wouldn't have worked, but she wasn't. When Arya saw the streak of darkness, a small bit of interest appeared in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by calm and disappointment. Arya turned around and looked at Nick with a neutral expression. "You can summon darkness?" she asked. "More or less," Nick said. "That's not entirely correct, but I don't want to expose too much." Arya nodded. She didn't need to know more. Her goal had been to confirm that Nick hadn't somehow attained the Nightmare's ability. Being able to summon a bit of darkness seemed very much in line with what the Fiend of Darkness granted Extractors. In a way, Arya was no longer afraid Nick had somehow gotten the Nightmare's ability, but she was also a bit disappointed. After all, getting the ability of an Eternal would be big news. Sadly, or luckily, Arya didn't see how hard Nick was trying not to collapse right now. Nick had essentially used 99% of his Zephyx to perform this little stunt. 99% of Zephyx just to make a tiny streak of black. That sounded horrible. And it would be, if this were Nick's actual ability. But it wasn't. Chapter 474, Finalizing the Plan. Luckily, Nick's Zephyx recovered extremely quickly. With his amazing shell and high stage, it barely took him a minute to recover all of it. "Then we have fulfilled our side of the death pact," Arya said. Nick nodded. "For now, if I succeed you still have to give me an elder." "If," Arya said. "However," Nick said, "while the mandatory things have been fulfilled, giving me another helping hand will definitely improve the chances of success, and I think it's in both our interests that my chances are as high as possible." Arya became annoyed. "Is there anything in particular you have in mind?" Nick nodded. Equipment. This is going to be a stealth mission, and as soon as I'm found, the mission will fail and I will die. Because of that, I need things that will aid me in escaping, staying hidden, and assassinating. Xing. Nick's blade shot out of his wrist, and he held it up for Arya. This blade might be useful in a normal battle, but it might break if I attack a specialist. Attack a specialist, Arya repeated in shock. That would be stupid. I get that you must feel amazing after becoming an expert, but don't overestimate yourself. Let that be my issue, Nick said calmly. I am the one going into anatomy, and Vernon has enough faith in me that he's willing to give me an elixir. I will tell you what I need, and if you want to improve my chances, it would be in your best interest to listen to me. Arya was annoyed by Nick's arrogance, but she knew this wasn't the moment to deal with such unimportant things. Fine, she said with a bit of annoyance. Nick nodded. Thank you. If possible, I would like a shadow shroud. Arya's eyes narrowed, shock and rage appearing in them. How the fuck did Nick know about the shadow shrouds? Those were secret. She glared at Nick for a couple of seconds. Nick only looked back with a neutral expression. I believe Vernon will be fine with giving you his, Arya said after a while. Right now, it didn't matter how Nick knew about the shadow shrouds. They were on the same side for now. Nick nodded. I also need fist blades that won't break if a specialist attacks them with full power. Arya didn't see why Nick would need something this expensive. After all, if he attacked a specialist, his remaining time in this world would be measured in seconds. Nevertheless, this concerned Kugelblitz's survival, and they had already given Nick the elixir, which was far more expensive than such a set of blades. We don't have such a set currently, but we can make one within the next couple of hours, Arya said. Nick nodded. After that, he requested a couple of gadgets, but those weren't very expensive. He didn't ask for an expensive set of throwing spears, since those were only useful in open places. Within the tiny hallways of anatomy, his throwing spears would only slow him down with their weight. Is that all? Arya asked. Yes, that's all, Nick said with a nod. Good, she said. Everything will be ready within 5 hours. For now, we should go back to Vernon and create a plan for attack. The two of them walked out of the containment unit, and Nick entered the briefcase again. They traveled back towards the highest floor and searched for Vernon. Since several hours had passed, Vernon was no longer in Arya's office. Instead, he was in his own office, looking quite worried, which was understandable since it didn't look good for Kugelblitz. Sure, Nick might give them a chance, but it was very slim. After leaving Nick in Vernon's office, Arya left to deal with the equipment Nick needed for the mission. Over the next stretch of time, Nick and Vernon made plans for the assault. Since this concerned Kugelblitz's survival, Vernon did not hold anything back. He unveiled the power of Kugelblitz's intelligence gathering by handing Nick an almost complete map of Anatomy's building. A couple of parts were grayed out since only the most powerful members of Anatomy had access to those, but 90% of the building was perfectly mapped out. They even knew which containment units held half of the Specters. Naturally, Vernon also told Nick what these Specters were and what they could do. While Nick knew everything about the hatchlings, adolescents, adults, and elders due to the offer Anatomy had made to all the manufacturers, Anatomy hadn't publicized any information about their fanatics. That was where Vernon helped. According to Vernon, Kugelblitz knew of 4 fanatics that Anatomy owned, but they couldn't be sure whether there was a 5th. There was a chance there were 5, and a very small chance there were 6. But there definitely weren't 7 otherwise. Anatomy would have grown much faster over the past decades. Eventually, Arya returned with all the equipment Nick had requested, and he pocketed it. The 3 of them planned some more, and eventually a complete plan took shape. Is everyone fine with this plan? Arya asked. Vernon nodded. Nick furrowed his brows. The other 2 looked at him. I just got an idea, Nick said. It's a risk, but if this works, it might improve our chances drastically. Arya and Vernon were interested. In the beginning, they had mostly dismissed Nick's contributions to the plan, but he had given quite a few valuable pieces of input during the discussion. Yes, Arya asked. I need you to bring me to somebody so that I can talk to them, Nick said. Arya raised an eyebrow. Involving anyone else will put everything at risk, she said. I know, which is why I said it's a risk, Nick said. Who? Arya asked finally. Nick's eyes gleamed. I want to talk to Ghosty. Chapter 475, Meeting with Ghosty. Nick explained his plan to Arya and Vernon, and in the end it was decided that they would take the risk. Nick went back into the briefcase with all the equipment he'd received, and Vernon carried him out of Kugelblitz. Vernon traveled 2 floors down and arrived at the floor where Gemini and Ghosty's lab were. Nick had entertained the thought of going to Ghosty alone, but decided against it. There was a high likelihood Ghosty would want something, and only Blitz had the power to grant him whatever he desired. The two of them entered the main hall of Ghosty's lab, made of shining chrome plating that gave the building a futuristic design. It looked just about how one would expect. Vernon reached the reception and came face to face with a smiling woman. Surprisingly, she was a veteran. "Welcome, Mr. Melfian," the receptionist said with a bright smile. "Ghosty has already informed me that you will be arriving." Vernon nodded, not surprised that Ghosty had anticipated his arrival. Ghosty always seemed to know what was going to happen. "Thank you, please lead the way," Vernon said with a smile of his own. The receptionist nodded and led Vernon down one of the hallways. After climbing a couple of stairs, she stopped in front of a door. Vernon knew this door well. He had talked with Ghosty many times over the decades. The receptionist knocked. "Come in," the neutral voice of an older man came through the door. The receptionist opened it but didn't step through, gesturing for Vernon to enter. Vernon nodded to her and walked through. "Ah, Vernon," Ghosty said with a calm voice, "I've expected you." The receptionist closed the door behind Vernon and left. "I'm not surprised anymore," Vernon said in an equally calm voice. "You always seem to know the future." Ghosty chuckled dryly. "Oh, come now. It's not difficult to foresee your arrival in the current situation." Vernon sighed and sat down. "I presume not," he said. Everything became silent for a couple of seconds. "So what is it you want to talk about?" Ghosty asked. Vernon took a deep breath. "I'm taking a very big risk by arriving here. Undoubtedly, Anatomy has already taken note of my arrival, and they will be more vigilant about me from now on. Additionally, I can't be sure you're still willing to give an old friend a helping hand after what Blitz has done." Ghosty didn't say anything and just smiled. Vernon had anticipated that Ghosty wouldn't give him an answer without important information about the plan, which was why this entire thing was so risky. "Tomorrow, we are going to call for a big meeting between all the heroes of Blitz and Anatomy. During that meeting, we are going to talk about Anatomy's acquisition of Blitz," Vernon said. Ghosty became noticeably intrigued, maybe even surprised, but who could fault him? Vernon had just said Blitz wasn't even going to try fighting Anatomy. Instead of trying to stop the bleeding, they were willing to slit their throats to embrace death. "How did Blitz come to that decision?" Ghosty asked. Vernon sighed again. "Wilfred and the shareholders are under Mundus control, and we didn't notice until it was too late." A gleam appeared in Ghosty's eyes as he scratched his chin in thought. "We're not entirely sure how he did it," Vernon continued, "but we believe Mundus took control of the shareholders when they were telling their representing directors about their desires for the company. As for Wilfred, we can't be entirely sure. You already know he started to step out of the public eye 40 years ago. However, we don't know if he was already under Mundus control back then or if it happened after. It was difficult to come into contact with Wilfred since he always said he didn't want to be disturbed by anything that didn't directly relate to Blitz's survival. For everyday matters, he left everything to Arya and me." Vernon sighed again. "That's why we don't have any other choice. Arya and I have tried our best, but we only represent 40% of Blitz. Mundus controls the other 60%, and whatever he wants to happen will happen." Ghosty nodded. "That does sound quite troublesome. You make it sound like Anatomy has already won." "Haven't they?" Vernon asked. Ghosty smirked a bit. "If they had, you wouldn't be here." "That's true," Vernon said with a small chuckle. "Blitz has given up, but that doesn't mean Arya and I have. We have a little plan. During the meeting tomorrow, one of our agents is going to infiltrate Anatomy and cause enough damage to make the fight equal." Ghosty raised an eyebrow. "That sounds unfeasible." "I know," Vernon said with a nod, "which is why Anatomy is not going to expect it. How could one agent possibly get past all the Coral people? If even one of them dies or sees the agent, everything is over. And this will give us a chance to succeed." Yet Ghosty didn't seem convinced. "That sounds very far-fetched. While Anatomy's confidence is certainly worth considering, it doesn't change the facts. Nobody is getting past all those Coral people. For that matter," Ghosty added, "how would you even get your agent into Anatomy? The only entrance is the main entrance, which is tightly guarded." At that moment, a confident smirk appeared on Vernon's face. "The same way I got the agent into this office," he said. Ghosty's eyes widened. "Their agent was in here. Ghosty was a very powerful specialist, and he also had a couple of machines surveilling the building. If Vernon had managed to get someone in here, that would truly be impressive. Chapter 476, Sincerity. The next moment, mist came out of the briefcase Vernon had carried with him, and Ghosty realized how Vernon had done it. Of course, he had noticed the briefcase, but he'd assumed it contained something Vernon was willing to offer him for his help. He hadn't expected a person to be inside. When the mist turned into Nick, Ghosty was shocked for several reasons. The first and biggest was that he had never heard of an extractor able to change the form of their body to this degree. There were abilities that could add something to someone's body, and abilities that could transform part of the body into a weapon or something similar. But Ghosty had never heard of an ability that could turn someone's entire body into something completely different. Even more striking was the fact that it was a gas. Even when somebody could change part of their body, the new part was always hard: metal, chitin, rock, and so on. Ghosty had heard of one guy who could turn his arm into magma, but the shape of the arm was still preserved. Turning one's entire body into mist, that was mind-boggling. Of course, Nick had shown this ability to a couple of people before, but none had been as surprised as Ghosty, the one who knew the most about most things in Crimson City. That was because Ghosty realized how truly strange the ability was. Experienced extractors like Arya or Vernon had come into contact with hundreds of extractors and their abilities, and they had long since gotten used to the strangeness of abilities. There were some really crazy ones out there, which was exactly why they weren't very surprised by Nick's. It was just one among many. But Ghosty knew better. As far as he knew, this was the first case of a human able to mimic the properties of a force specter. This was extraordinary. The second reason Ghosty was surprised was that Nick had managed to get in here without being noticed. Yes, he'd been inside the briefcase, shielding him from view, but Ghosty was very good at sensing Zephyx. Surprisingly, the briefcase hadn't given off any Zephyx until Nick appeared, which was strange. Force Specters gave off more Zephyx than normal Specters or Extractors at baseline, since their bodies were mostly liquid or gaseous. It was harder for them to keep Zephyx contained due to their loose properties. In his fog state, Nick was mimicking the properties of a force specter, so how had Ghosty not been able to sense him? In that state, he should have given off a considerable amount of Zephyx. Additionally, the briefcase showed no signs of being tampered with. It was just a normal briefcase. Ghosty didn't know how Nick had managed to contain all his Zephyx inside his body while in his fog state. Of course, the last reason Ghosty was surprised was that Vernon was betting on Nick. First, as far as Ghosty knew, Nick was a peak veteran, not someone who could infiltrate anatomy. Second, Nick wasn't even part of Blitz. Why would Blitz bet their survival on some random peak veteran who didn't even work for them? This sounded completely bizarre. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed it. Blitz really had to be out of options if this was what they came up with. But on the other hand, Nick had managed to get in here without being noticed. He'd entered Ghosty's office in secret. That was nothing to scoff at. Vernon chuckled. I knew I needed to prove the feasibility of this plan. If I'd just told you what our plan was, you would have thought me crazy. That's unusual, Ghosty said. Nick nodded. Hello, Ghosty, he said. The two of them talked to each other occasionally, and Ghosty wasn't someone who put a lot of importance on politeness. Fancy seeing you here, Nick, Ghosty said. I was under the impression this would be a meeting between two people. Ghosty looked between Vernon and Nick. Understandable. He quickly regained his composure and looked back at Vernon. But I still don't know why you are here. He was the one who wanted to meet you, Vernon said. I'm just here to deliver him. Oh, Ghosty uttered, glancing at Nick with interest. At that moment, Nick furrowed his brows. If he wanted to succeed, he knew he needed all the help he could get, and he also knew Ghosty would want a show of sincerity before considering it. I have signed a death pact with Vernon, Nick said. Ghosty was not really surprised. This was about Blitz's survival. Naturally, Vernon wouldn't take any chances. The terms are that I have to do everything in my power to weaken anatomy enough to give Blitz a fighting chance, Nick said. I'm confident I can infiltrate anatomy, but I'm not sure how I can cause enough damage to it. That's why I need your help. Ghosty's lab produces almost all the equipment the manufacturers use, and there must be some way to take advantage of that, Nick said. A gleam appeared in Ghosty's eyes. Do you realize what you're suggesting? He asked. Nick nodded wordlessly. Ghosty remained silent for a while. Why should I help you? He asked. This was it. This was the riskiest moment. If Nick didn't show sincerity, he knew everything would be over. I'm willing to trust you. Blitz is willing to trust you. I am certain Anatomy will not trust you. Ghosty could tell Nick was about to say something very interesting. As proof of my trust, I will tell you something that only one other person in this city knows. I have the ability of the Null. Chapter 477, Surrounded by Danger. I'm here to meet Mundus, Vernon said. Vernon stood in a dark hall in front of a barely illuminated desk. Behind it sat a woman with a blank expression, corals growing out of the back of her head. Vernon recognized her. This woman had been one of Blitz's experts just 2 days ago. The deadline the city had set for Anatomy Specters was today, but even though it was already late evening, there was still no movement from the city. However, he had already expected that. The governor had said Anatomy was supposed to deal with all their weak specters, but he probably wouldn't take action. Everyone knew why. Most likely, the governor had set the deadline to make the decision about which side to join for him. If nobody accepted Anatomy's offer, he might have chosen Blitz and fought against Anatomy. However, over half of Anatomy's specters had been bought, and most importantly, all their elders and over 75% of their adults, meaning they had already gained almost all the employees they could possibly get. By now, it was obvious the governor would choose Anatomy's side. Was it stupid? Wasn't he afraid Anatomy would also force him into servitude? No, because the governor was part of Aegis. As long as the city kept sending Zephyx and the normal people had a passable quality of life, Aegis wouldn't get involved. Of course, with so many extractors becoming unable to work with Specters, general Zephyx production suffered. However, every extractor controlled by the Sea King also made the Sea King produce more Zephyx. So even though so many extractors couldn't work with the Specters anymore, production had only suffered a little, and it still fulfilled Aegis' quota. As for the necessary competition among manufacturers that Aegis demanded, that wouldn't be an issue either. They just had to leave Ghosty's lab alone, and maybe Gemini too. That would still be competition enough, even though those two obviously couldn't even attempt to fight Anatomy. Follow, the woman said with a raspy voice as she turned around, taking hold of the lamp behind her and gesturing to the side. Since Anatomy only had 8 humans left, they decided to kill all the lights inside their building. The humans controlled by the Sea King weren't affected by the nightmare. Well, that wasn't technically true. Technically, they had all already been killed by the nightmare. It had tortured them into unconsciousness and then destroyed their minds. However, their bodies were still alive. As long as the organs still received orders from somewhere, they wouldn't stop working. This meant the coral people were brain dead, but still walking around as if alive. As for the couple of humans still alive in Anatomy, they simply walked around with special lamps. There were also a couple of places in the building that still had a bit of light, but over 80% of the building was in complete darkness, and almost nobody could walk around in it. They needed either a light or the ability to produce one on their own, and the latter required the power of a specialist and a lot of Zephyx to keep active. Like this, Anatomy had created a fortress. Vernon nodded and followed the coral woman as she walked forward, holding the lamp high. Vernon wasn't sure if he'd ever been in such a dark place. He wasn't a fighter. He'd worked with many Specters, but he'd never truly been involved in capturing one or exploring the outside world. While Vernon seemed calm on the surface, he was actually very afraid deep inside. He was risking his life by coming here. If Anatomy decided to kill him, there would be nothing Blitz could do about it. The only things he could rely on were Anatomy's confidence and their trepidation about starting the war too abruptly. There was still a chance the governor might decide to stay neutral even when the last fight was happening, and Anatomy did not want that. The coral woman led Vernon up several flights of stairs until they arrived in a dimly lit hallway. It was not very bright, but bright enough to keep the nightmare at bay, just barely. If one didn't have a strong mind, one might see faint illusions. Even though Vernon wasn't a fighter, his mind was still powerful enough to resist the subtle influence. The two of them reached a containment unit, but shockingly, its door was open. In fact, it wasn't just open, it was destroyed. The coral woman gestured for Vernon to walk in. He took a deep breath and did. Inside, he saw a gigantic network of corals stretching all over the containment unit, some even extending out through a couple of holes. In the middle stood a pillar of corals connecting the floor to the tall ceiling. Even though he'd never seen it with his own eyes, Vernon could tell this was the Sea King. 2 people stood in front of it, Ariel Cerulean and Mundus Stairwell. Zarin Harrow was nowhere to be seen. The containment unit was brighter than the hallway, but not by much. Vernon, Mundus said with a neutral voice. Even though Anatomy had every reason to be confident, Mundus showed no arrogance or carelessness. He appeared just like always cold and calculating. Mundus, Vernon said with a nod before looking at Ariel. Ariel. Ariel didn't look at him, keeping her eyes on the Sea King. Even though Anatomy was working with it, they did not trust each other. Ariel stood beside it every second of every day. If it didn't follow an order, she would kill it. Of course, the Sea King had a lot of soft power. If it died, Blitz would become the favorite to win the war. That gave it plenty of negotiating power. At the back of the room stood a veteran with corals growing out of his ears, used as the Sea King's mouthpiece since it couldn't talk on its own. "Why are you here?" Mundus asked neutrally. Vernon took a deep breath. "You won," he said. Mundus didn't answer. "Everything has been clear since the day before yesterday," Vernon continued. "You managed to take advantage of Blitz's scattered ownership and made us kill ourselves." "You probably already know why I'm here since we spoke about it," Vernon said. "Why are you here?" Mundus repeated, not confirming or denying anything. "Blitz wants a meeting with Anatomy in 6 hours," Vernon said. "We want to propose a merger with Anatomy." Naturally, this was not a merger of equal power. In essence, Vernon was saying Anatomy was allowed to purchase a majority of Blitz's stock, while Blitz got a minority of Anatomy's. What happened after that was up to Anatomy, since they'd have control over both companies. Would they absorb Blitz, keep it as a puppet? The reason Blitz suggested a merger instead of a takeover was so it would seem like there was still competition in the city, making it easier to fulfill Aegis competition requirement. "A meeting," Mundus repeated with a neutral voice. "Where will it take place?" "Inside Ghosty's lab. We realize holding it inside Blitz is too disadvantageous for you, but we also don't want to hold it inside Anatomy. After all, Blitz's owners are also just human, and we don't want to unnecessarily risk our lives." Mundus remained quiet for a while. Then he glanced at Ariel. She looked back with a neutral expression. After that, he glanced at the coral person in the back of the room, who shrugged. Mundus looked to the side for a while. "Fine," he said, looking back at Vernon. Vernon didn't show any reaction, but the tension deep inside him vanished. "Thank you," Vernon said with a quick, polite bow. Mundus looked at him a bit longer, then glanced down. "What's in the suitcase? You've been carrying it around everywhere recently," Mundus said. Vernon looked at him, then put the suitcase on the ground and slowly opened it. When Mundus saw what was inside, his eyes shone. "Proof of our intention," Vernon said, taking a couple of steps back. "I presume you recognize it." Mundus didn't answer, but he recognized it. The most powerful possession Specter in all of Crimson City, the only fanatic possession Specter. A bloody sniper rifle that could deal tremendous damage and turn its victim into Zephyx. It was called the Money Maker, and it was the most powerful weapon in Crimson City, except for the governor's spear, made by Aegis. The Money Maker had long worried Anatomy, since a specialist could use it to kill several other specialists, or maybe even a hero if given the opportunity. Handing it over was almost like handing over a hero. "Interesting," Mundus said. Chapter 478, The Big Negotiation. Vernon sat at a table, looking down with a solemn expression. Beside him sat Arya, staring into space with a neutral look. Wilfred sat weakly beside her, wearing a peaceful smile as he sipped tea. 6 more directors from Blitz sat beside them on the same side of the table. Ghosty and Herman Reichert sat at the bottom, both seemingly neutral. This was the biggest meeting room Ghosty's lab had. They all waited in silence. Some time later, someone knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. The governor walked in. "Hello, everyone," he said neutrally, walking to the head of the table. "Hello and thank you for coming," Wilfred said with a polite smile, standing to greet him. The governor looked at Wilfred with a neutral expression. "It's been a while, Wilfred. I wish the circumstances were different." "Do you?" Vernon thought, annoyance not showing on his face. "Well, there's not much we can do," Wilfred said with a helpless smile. "Anatomy managed to take advantage of our weaknesses and outplayed us." The governor nodded wordlessly and sat down at the head of the table, then looked around the room. "Vanessa and Jornies are not here?" he asked. "We are not here to fight," Arya said, "and they are not owners of Blitz. There's no reason for them to be here." Vanessa and Jornies were Blitz's other 2 heroes. Technically, Blitz only had 3 heroes. The 4th was the governor himself, an honorary member. The governor looked at Arya with a neutral expression, unsure whether to believe her. Was Blitz really intending to just keel over and capitulate? Or were Jornies and Vanessa planning some kind of ambush on Anatomy's headquarters? Fine, the governor said. Everything went quiet again. Naturally, none of the people in the room were calm, even though most appeared to be. Even the ones being controlled were nervous. While the directors weren't directly controlled, they were indirectly controlled by having to act on the wishes of the owners in the upper layer, who told them they wanted to hand Cujoblitz over. The directors weren't the biggest fans of that. If the owners lost ownership of Cujoblitz, the directors would be out of a job. Sure, they didn't need the money, but having a job was something to take pride in. Ghosty and Herman were nervous because this meeting was happening inside their building. If a fight broke out, their company would get destroyed, and the governor feared he might have to get involved in a fight. He did not want to fight anyone. Some minutes passed. Then someone knocked and the door opened. Everyone looked over to see Mundus step in, followed by Zarin. Ariel was not with them, but that was expected. Even now, she had to guard the Sea King to ensure its loyalty. "Glad to see you too," Wilfred said with a weak smile, standing to greet them. For some reason, he kept looking at Mundus with intense focus. The other members of Cujoblitz also greeted the two, except for Vernon and Arya. There was no reason to act polite anymore. Everything was going to be over soon. "Mundus," the governor said with a nod. Mundus nodded back while handing out half-hearted greetings to the others. Eventually, he and Zarin sat down opposite Cujoblitz. It was 2 against 9. As they sat, Zarin shot a quick glance at Ghosty, who smiled back confidently. Amongst everyone present, Mundus and Zarin were probably the calmest. They knew the governor would follow them, but that wasn't the entire reason. They'd also been in contact with Ghosty. As the soon-to-be overlords of Crimson City, Anatomy was unassailable, and Ghosty's lab had already realized this. Ghosty and Anatomy had come to an agreement. They'd leave Ghosty's lab alone, and in return, Ghosty would not help Cujoblitz in any way. While Ghosty's personal power wasn't tremendous, his soft power was on the same level as the governor's. Ghosty's lab made almost all the containment units and gadgets for Specter containment and hunting. His technologies were woven into almost every object of relevance. Nobody knew if he had some kind of failsafe hidden in some of them. Angering Ghosty could very quickly end in disaster. "Let's start with the negotiations," the governor said. "Of course," Wilfred said, turning to look at everyone at the table. "We have all gathered here to discuss our merger with Anatomy. Naturally, we've already talked about everything beforehand, and I'm now going to present our offer." Wilfred looked at Mundus. "We have decided to offer 60% of Cujoblitz to Anatomy." Nobody was surprised. "However," Wilfred said with an embarrassed smile, "we couldn't agree on a fitting price. Because of that, we are not going to act as a unit but as individuals." Mundus' eyes narrowed, and a small gleam appeared in the governor's eyes. This was unusual. In these kinds of negotiations, a company had to act as a unit. Letting everyone sell shares individually in such a big meeting was very unusual. "Fine," Mundus said, showing no meaningful reaction. "We are interested in owning 60% of Cujoblitz, who will keep the remaining 40%. "Arya and Vernon," Wilfred explained. Nobody was surprised. "The directors and I have already dedicated our shares to the merger. The only thing left to discuss is price." Mundus looked at Wilfred without amusement. Wilfred just smiled back. "Allow me to go first. I'm willing to exchange my 30% of Cujoblitz for 10% of Anatomy," he said. Arya and Vernon showed no outward reaction, but both wanted to snort. As it stood, Cujoblitz was still worth more than Anatomy. They had far more Specters and more powerful Extractors. A fair valuation would be 10% of Cujoblitz for 20% of Anatomy, and yet Wilfred was offering 30% of Cujoblitz for only 10% of Anatomy. Ridiculous. Sadly, also expected. "That's a fair offer," Mundus said with a nod, looking at Zarin. Zarin understood and nodded as well. "I'm willing to exchange 10% of my 30% of Anatomy for your 30% of Cujoblitz," he said. Wilfred smiled brightly and performed a quick polite bow. "Thank you, we have a deal." He sat back down and gestured to the director beside him, who took a deep breath and stood up. "The owners I represent have agreed to exchange their 5% of Cujoblitz for 2% of Anatomy," he said. That was a bit more expensive than Wilfred's offer. Mundus furrowed his brows and remained silent for a couple of seconds. "That's the limit of what we're willing to accept," he said, "but we still accept." The director bowed politely. "Thank you." Then the next director stood. "The people I represent would also like 2% for their 5%, he said. Mundus accepted again. At the side, Vernon and Arya grew more nervous. This meeting was ending too quickly. They needed to buy time for Nick. Right now, he was probably just starting his infiltration. The next director stood. "The people I represent want 5% for their 5%, he said. The atmosphere shifted. Vernon and Arya looked over in surprise. The director had asked for an equal trade. Even Wilfred seemed shocked. "Spencer, we decided on a majority of shares for a minority of shares," he said. Spencer, the director, just smiled. "And that will still hold true. Anatomy has already received 40% of Cujoblitz for 14% of Anatomy. If the remaining shareholders just trade equally, Anatomy will own 60% of Cujoblitz for 34% of Anatomy." Wilfred looked at Spencer with shock. Where had that come from? Mundus narrowed his eyes at the director, who was only a John. Yet Spencer didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he seemed quite confident. "We can't do that," Mundus said. "That's too much." "Do you have a counteroffer?" Spencer asked. 5% for 3% is as far as I'll go," Mundus said. Spencer sighed. "I'm sorry, but I can't accept that in good conscience. I have a duty as a director to uphold my client's best interests." For the next 10 minutes, Arya and Vernon watched in wonder as Spencer negotiated with Mundus. "Fine, you'll get your 5%, Mundus said with suppressed anger. "Just hope you don't regret it." It was all too clear what Mundus meant. He might decide to get rid of the director after the merger. Spencer just smiled and sat back down. Then the next director stood up. 5% of Cujoblitz for 7% of Anatomy. The atmosphere shifted again. Mundus and Zarin narrowed their eyes. Meanwhile, Arya and Vernon were surprised. Was this what Nick had meant? Before the mission started, he'd said he had a way to buy time during the negotiation. Had he somehow managed to influence the shareholders? 2 kilometers lower, in an office inside Dark Dream. Julian chuckled. Chapter 479, New Ability. Silence and darkness. The majority of Anatomy's building was completely dark. The only sounds were the slow footsteps of patrolling coral people. Mundus and Zarin were currently outside, leaving Anatomy in a vulnerable position, so all the coral people had been activated. 180 of them were standing and walking around the hallways. Anatomy's building was huge, but such a large number still put nearly every part of it under constant surveillance. The Sea King was making sure nobody was trying anything, paying attention to every part of the building through the eyes and ears of its servants. One of the coral people stepped into a staircase and slowly crept up. Yet, without them noticing, 2 eyes opened in the darkness below the stairs. Time to start, Nick thought. When Vernon had entered Anatomy, Nick had slipped out through an opening in the briefcase while Vernon climbed the stairs. But wait, hadn't a coral person been with them? Wouldn't they have noticed? Yes, they would have, if not for Nick's new ability. The eyes in the darkness looked up at the feet of the coral person ascending the staircase. Nick fully materialized, crouched down, and released a huge amount of Zephyx. The coral person didn't notice any of it. Nick jumped. His feet lightly tapped the wall behind him, and he shot toward the coral person, his right hand moving quickly but carefully toward one of the pockets in its uniform. Pling! He placed a round object inside. It seemed to weigh a couple of kilos, but strangely, the coral person didn't react. Anyone would notice a dense 5-kilo object dropped in their pocket, but shockingly, this one didn't. In a fluid motion, Nick jumped up and reached the next floor. Shing! He cut through the floor, carving out a thin piece about 30 centimeters long and 5 wide. The metallic piece fell, but he caught it in a small black sack made of a strange material. The debris vanished, and the sack didn't even seem to grow. Nick turned into mist and entered the crack. He didn't go out the other end, he just stayed inside it. Finally, the dense Zephyx in the surroundings vanished, and the coral person continued walking up the stairs as if nothing had happened. Anyone watching would be shocked. How had it not noticed this? Nick's emotions slowly calmed as he stayed in the crack. That was only a veteran, but it still consumed 20% of my Zephyx to pull off, he thought. But as he felt his Zephyx rapidly recovering thanks to his shell, his confidence returned. 15 seconds and I'll be full again. In his mist form, Nick watched the coral person ascend the stairs and cross the floor where he was hiding. He'd already deactivated his ability, but it still didn't notice anything amiss, this time for a different reason. The spot where Nick had cut through the ground was at the edge of the corridor, and his mist made it look like the floor tile was still there. As for the object in the coral person's pocket, it went unnoticed thanks to their sheer strength. A veteran was over 100 times stronger than a normal human. 5 kilograms to them was like less than 50 grams to a normal person. Would someone notice an extra 50 grams in their pocket without reaching in? No, not unless the object was quite big. The coral person's own strength was exactly what Nick was exploiting. So even without his new ability, they wouldn't notice the object as long as they didn't put a hand in their pocket. And what point did pockets even have for a coral person? The only reason they wore clothing at all was that it would look strange for everyone to walk around naked inside the building. Yes, the coral people were minions of a Specter, but they still looked human, and having them walk around naked would just draw unwanted attention. So what did Nick's new ability actually do? It was the ability of an Eternal, so of course it was amazing. It had 3 effects. The first was immunity to the nightmare's influence, letting Nick move freely in the darkness. The second was that his mist turned black when surrounded by darkness. But the most useful was the third. It could be activated whenever someone didn't perceive him consciously. Consciously mattered a person could technically see him in their peripheral vision without taking note of him. While a bird searches the sky for food, there might be tens of insects in its field of view, but it only registers a few. The rest are camouflaged. The insects are in the bird's vision, but the bird isn't perceiving them. While not being consciously perceived, Nick could subtly influence someone's perception, just like the nightmare. Of course, this cost a lot of Zephyx, and the more powerful the target, the more it cost. When Nick had used it on Arya after returning from the nightmare's domain, he'd burned almost all his Zephyx just to create a short-lived illusion of a bit of darkness, one that lasted less than the blink of an eye and was extremely subtle, almost unnoticeable. Yet due to Arya's power, it still cost him nearly everything. As for the veteran coral person just now, Nick had simply made it seem like nothing out of the ordinary was happening. None of the sounds from cutting through the floor registered. The object in its pocket felt like nothing more than a gust of wind against the fabric. Naturally, the more aspects of a person's senses Nick manipulated, the more Zephyx it took. He'd created a subtle sensation and suppressed some sound. He hadn't hidden his body from view. If he hadn't been careful, the coral person would have seen him. Luckily, one of the coral people's strengths was also one of their weaknesses, their shared senses. 180 bodies, one mind. That mind was extremely powerful, but viewing 180 different images and listening to 180 different feeds at once was a lot, even for it. If a human had to monitor 20 different video feeds, there were only 2 effective ways to do it. Focus on one at a time while flipping through them, or unfocus the eyes and watch all of them for changes. Naturally, the Sea King used the second method. It unfocused its metaphorical eyes and only noted sensations it didn't expect to feel. If Nick had entered a coral person's peripheral vision, the Sea King would have noticed the movement and focused in. Because of that, it was critical he stay out of it. Creating or hiding images cost much more Zephyx than manipulating sound. Humans were visual creatures, and a huge part of perception revolved around the eyes. A deaf person could live a relatively normal life. A blind person was almost helpless. Using this ability took precision, not too much manipulation, not too little. But one thing was clear, it was perfect for Nick. His ability to create blinding light helped him escape into obscurity, and this new one helped him stay there. Sadly, it too became useless the moment someone actually perceived him. I don't want to be an assassin, but the abilities I get keep forcing me down this path, Nick thought, watching the coral person pass by his crack. I guess I should just accept it. From the floor below, Nick heard a door open. Just like always, he thought, watching the new coral person enter the staircase below him. They patrolled the entire building with machine-like precision. And that will be their undoing, Nick thought. If a system was perfect, it was predictable. If something always acted perfectly, one only had to know what the perfect action would be to predict it. The coral person reached the spot below Nick. A lot of Zephyx spilled out of the crack he was hiding in, and a moment later, black mist rushed out after it. Chapter 480, Stressful Stealth. Nick looked at the coral person walking past him on the lower floor. This was the first one that had passed by. He hadn't moved at all in the last 20 minutes. The coral person had simply finished their round and started again. Nick wasn't completely sure what route they followed, but based on the floor plans, he assumed they went up this staircase, to one of the higher floors, down another staircase to the ground floor, back to this staircase, and up again. 64, Nick thought. 64 of them are on this route, time to move. A huge amount of Zephyx gathered around him as he jumped out of the crack on the second floor. An instant later, he pulled the metallic piece he'd cut out earlier and put it back into place. "Crrr," He bent it to keep it locked. Naturally, if someone looked closely, they'd see the floor had been damaged, but Nick was betting the Sea King didn't focus on every single part of it. An instant later, Nick walked forward and stopped behind another coral person walking ahead of him, using his ability to suppress the sound of his steps and glancing back to make sure the coral person behind him wasn't about to see his back. Luckily, the Sea King avoided fixating on moving things, which was why the patrolling coral people never looked at each other. When Nick saw the gap between them was wide enough that neither could see him, he turned to Mist and deactivated his ability. In Mist form, he could travel without making noise. Like this, he kept following the coral person in front as they ascended. Nick wanted to enter one of the floors, but he couldn't. Opening a door was way too conspicuous, and if a coral person was watching from the other side, they'd notice immediately. Nick had to see his target to use his ability. Making a hole near a door was also too risky. The floor had worked because no coral person looked down or up while walking, only forward. So Nick had to keep following the coral person until they reached the floor where they'd continue on. After ascending over 10 floors, he saw them stop in front of a door. They moved a hand over its side and it opened. Nick's heart rate spiked. This was one of the riskiest moments of his mission. He made himself as small as possible, floating behind the coral person's torso, while glancing back to track the one climbing the stairs behind him. The coral person in front stepped through the door. A tiny bit of mist slipped past their torso to scout ahead. Another coral person, and it was looking directly at the one Nick was following. Nick immediately used his ability to influence their vision and rushed toward the corner of the hallway. At the same moment, the coral person behind him turned the corner to look at the floor. If Nick had still been behind the other one, this one would have seen him, but as it stood, he was hidden by the doorframe. His Zephyx was dropping rapidly, 50%, 30%, 20%. Bang! The door closed, and Nick immediately jumped behind the coral person again and deactivated his ability. I have 10 seconds until the door opens again, Nick thought, metaphorical sweat streaming down his misty face. The coral person in the hallway kept staring at the door. As the two coral people came closer to each other, Nick used his ability once more, dropping to the floor beneath the other one's feet and clouding its sense of feeling. The one who'd walked in front of Nick passed the one in the hallway. Nick slipped out from between its legs and stayed behind it, deactivating his ability. Now both had their backs to him. The door opened as the next coral person entered, but since Nick was behind the one in the hallway, it didn't see him. He was almost touching the coral person beside him. If it moved even slightly, he'd be spotted. But it never did. That was what Nick had bet on. The coral people acted like perfect machines. A human would fidget or glance around out of boredom. Any of that would have exposed him. But there was no reason for them to do anything like that. They were fully dedicated to their task, and this one's task was to watch the door. 10 seconds later, Nick slipped between its legs again and clouded its feeling once more. The next coral person walked past and he came out again. 10 seconds later, the same thing again. After a full minute, he'd finally achieved his goal. His Zephyx had recovered. Using his ability to control the coral person's feeling every 10 seconds didn't cost much, letting him recover fully in the gaps between patrols. Nevertheless, that last minute had been incredibly stressful. One moment of carelessness, and he'd have been found. If it weren't for my special shell, I wouldn't be able to recover like this, Nick thought. When the next coral person passed, Nick burned a ton of Zephyx and materialized again. He slipped something into its pocket and pointed a small device at its hand. Ding! The device indicated it was done, and Nick returned to Mist. He recovered his Zephyx over the next minute, then attached the device to a chip from his bag and slipped the chip into a glove he was wearing. Then he floated backward. In an instant, he burned a ton of Zephyx to influence everyone in the hallway and, as fast as he could, pressed his glove to a door. Ding! The door opened and Nick shot inside. Bang! The door closed immediately and Nick took a deep breath, waiting in silence. 10 seconds passed. Then Nick released a sigh. That had been insanely risky, one wrong move and they'd have seen him. But he'd done it and now he could finally relax. Nick looked around and found himself in one of the locker rooms in front of a containment unit. He'd bet on the fact that no coral person would linger here. After all, why would they? To reach these rooms, someone had to pass through the hallway, so it made more sense to guard the hallway than the locker room itself. 11th floor, first room in the east, Nick thought, recalling the floor plan. This containment unit should be empty. He went to the entrance and looked at the console, deactivated. Just as expected, Nick thought, looking up. The next floor is where the specialist's offices are. There should also be light. He went to the ceiling and touched it. Knock. Nick lightly knocked. The sound was almost imperceptible. Nothing. Knock. Stronger this time, still nothing. What was Nick doing? Creating tiny bits of noise to check whether someone was in the office above. If they heard it, they'd look at the ground, and at that moment his main ability would flicker since they'd technically perceived him a little. If that happened, Nick would just stop. The sound was subtle enough that a specialist would assume it was just a random noise from one of the coral people. Most likely, they wouldn't investigate. They might not even be able to. Which specialist would want to remain in anatomy? Anatomy had transformed all its people into coral people. Every normal person there would believe they were next. Most likely, anatomy was keeping its specialists under house arrest to stop them from fleeing. The only reason they hadn't been transformed yet was to avoid complications with their fanatics. Anatomy still needed some specialists to handle those. Nick took a deep breath and unsheathed his blade. Chapter 481, the same thing. Nick cut through the ceiling near the wall. His ability was still active, so nobody could hear him. As soon as he cut through, light streamed in from the gap. Nick turned into mist and passed through, then materialized on the other side, looking for something to cover the cut. He just hoped this office wasn't owned by a clean freak. Luckily, it wasn't. Papers were scattered here and there. Nick grabbed a couple and laid them over the cut. He knew the office belonged to one of the specialists, but not which one, and he had no idea when they'd return. He had to act quickly. Nick shot upward and cut through the ceiling without hesitation, reached the next floor and bent the ceiling back into shape. It wasn't perfect, but if the specialist returned, they most likely wouldn't notice a small, uneven patch. They were probably too busy despairing at their fate. Nick wasn't afraid of going up another floor since this one had no offices. It was also completely dark again. Just like the room 2 floors down, this was a locker room leading to a containment unit. Nick thought back to the floor plan. This should be the containment unit for their previous main Specter, the Pit of Corpses, he thought. The Pit of Corpses was a peak fanatic that mindlessly consumed corpses. It had no intelligence and attacked anything it could see. When Nick looked at the containment unit, a dark pit seemed to open in his stomach. He remembered freeing the Crimson Sea and the devastation it had wrought on the city. It's different this time, he thought. I told Arya about my plan, and she said she's prepared to deal with any Specters that break out. Freeing the Pit of Corpses is part of the plan. Even if something happens, it's not on me this time. Nick walked over to the console. It was active, as expected. He retrieved an object from the black sack, a monitor with several metallic cables coming out of it. Remembering what Ghosty had told him, he carefully opened a panel on the side of the console. Over the next 5 minutes, Nick plugged in the cables at different spots, then pressed several buttons until a menu appeared. He now had all rights for the containment unit, not even anatomy had those. They thought they did, but as expected, Ghosty had reserved special privileges for himself. Several functions weren't normally available. One was self-destruction. All the Zephyx in the containers would be transformed into an explosive that would flood the containment unit and detonate. Normal physical Specters were unlikely to survive, though there was a chance. But that wasn't the option Nick wanted. He was more interested in immediate opening. If pressed, the containment unit would open immediately and release the Specter, no alarm. Nick fidgeted with the gadget for a while before setting a timer. 2 hours. He set a portable timer he carried with him to match. When he was done, he pocketed the gadget again and sighed. It was final now. In 2 hours, the Pit of Corpses would break out, and Nick would release a mindless peak fanatic into the city. After some time, he went to one of the walls and cut through it, repairing the cut behind him just like before. As expected, no coral people were stationed in any of the locker rooms, and Nick arrived in the next one. He thought back to the floor plan and narrowed his eyes. The Doomsayer, he thought. If he freed this one, many people would die. However, there was one important distinction between it and the Pit of Corpses. The Doomsayer was intelligent. Nick had already thought about what to do with this Specter. Over the next couple of minutes, he fidgeted with the gadget again, but this time he didn't open the containment unit. Instead, he took a deep breath and opened the employee entrance. It opened, but no light came in. Naturally, Specters didn't need light. Nick looked into the darkness. Come in and face reality. A dark voice echoed from the containment unit. Nick's heart felt like it froze over. Luckily, this containment unit filtered the Doomsayer's power. It couldn't use its ability by speaking through the employee entrance. As long as Nick didn't enter, he wouldn't fall under its spell. Nick walked up to the entrance and stopped, looking in. In the middle of the black containment unit stood a tall man completely hidden beneath a black cloak. The way he stood there put terror in Nick's heart. "What a strong one I have received today," the doomsayer spoke, its face hidden beneath a black cowl. "I'm not from anatomy, and I'm not here to die," Nick said. "It has a mind of its own," the doomsayer said. "There is no point in avoiding the inevitable." "Okay, listen," Nick said. "I'm anatomy's enemy, and in a bit less than 2 hours this entire building will turn into a hellscape. Blitz, the biggest manufacturer in the city with 3 heroes, is going to fight a war of annihilation with anatomy. I'm an agent from Blitz, and I'm preparing everything for the war." The doomsayer went silent. Then a slow, dark chuckle came from it. "A war of annihilation, death shall be plentiful." "You can be part of it," Nick said. The chuckle grew louder. "Relay your missive." "There are 4 ways this can go, depending on your cooperation," Nick said. 1. You're uncooperative. I won't open the containment unit, and you stay here until Blitz takes you in. 2. You say you're cooperative but do nothing. You'll most likely stay here even with the door open, and Blitz takes you in regardless. 3. You're cooperative. You'll be released in about 2 hours. I need you to cause as much damage as possible to the building. If you see anyone with corals coming out of their body, you're free to kill them. They're minions of the Sea King, Anatomy's biggest specter. After causing chaos, run out of the city as fast as you can. All the heroes of Blitz and Anatomy will be busy fighting each other to the death. It's your only shot at freedom. 4. You're cooperative but bloodthirsty. If you break out and decide to kill the humans of the city instead, one of Blitz's heroes will hunt you down and kill you directly. Aegis won't allow a city's citizens to be slaughtered like that. Blitz, freedom, death. These are your options. What do you choose? Nick asked. The doomsayer hadn't stopped chuckling since Nick started speaking. If anything, its amusement only grew. "Running from the inevitable is mindless folly," it said. "It will come for everyone regardless, whether now or later. Many people need to hear the truth of existence. With freedom, more humans can be enlightened. I will follow Blitz's orders." Nick sighed in relief. "Good. Don't forget that being uncooperative will end in your destruction. You might be powerful, but a casual attack from a hero will still annihilate you. Go wild in this building if you want, but the moment you leave it, focus on running." "I do not require your useless ramblings, human," the doomsayer said. "You have heard my answer. Proceed accordingly." Nick rolled his eyes. "Sure." The employee entrance closed, and Nick went back to the gadget, checked the portable timer, and set the release order. After sending it, he pocketed the gadget and moved to the next locker room. This one was empty, so Nick. "Wait a second," he thought, looking at the console. It was active. Nick's eyes shone. Chapter 482, Not Everything. This should be empty, Nick thought, but it obviously isn't, or the console wouldn't be active. So one of the hidden fanatics must be in there. I have to check. Nick had 2 guesses as to what kind of Specter it could be. He approached the console, attached the gadget, fidgeted for a while, and opened the employee entrance. It was dangerous opening the entrance to an unknown Specter, but the containment unit should isolate its powers, most of the time at least. "Well, I've taken enough risks today. What's one more?" Nick thought, walking over to look inside. In the middle of the containment unit was a pale white snake, covered in red spots, looking rather sickly. It should be this one then, so Anatomy had it. Not surprised, Nick thought. Based on the snake's appearance, he could take a good guess at its power. Usually, without any information, it would be hard to identify a Specter just from looks, but not this one. This must be the cause of debilify. Debilify was a plague that infected seemingly random people across the city. Anyone suffering from it would have all their energy drained, forcing them into permanent bed rest. Just eating and drinking became as exhausting as sports. Tragically, there was no cure. Sufferers lived in that condition until they died, most too exhausted to eat and slowly starving. But just to be sure, I have to check something else, Nick thought, looking at the snake from outside the entrance. "Lord Envy has sent me to free you," Nick said. The snake just looked at him, as it had ever since he'd opened the entrance. "Your greater relay has been destroyed, and Lord Envy's hold on the city has weakened. New Specters can't be sent in, the city's too fortified. In a bit less than 2 hours, the door will open. Cause chaos in the building for a couple of seconds, kill as many humans as you can find, then run out of the city before you're captured." The snake didn't react. "Are you able to do that?" Nick asked. It didn't move. Silence. Bang. Nick jumped back in fright as the snake suddenly lunged, but the barrier of the employee entrance activated and repelled it. Bang. The entrance slammed shut on its own, and Nick felt a couple more impacts against the door. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Okay, so it's not Envy's servant. Creating a greater relay takes intelligence, and this thing seemed pretty mindless. I doubt anyone could teach it that, Nick thought, looking at the closed door. Sad. Would have been convenient if Envy's servant and Debilify's source were the same Specter. Nick walked over to the console and studied it for a while. I'm not sure it's a good idea to release this one. The pit of corpses isn't subtle, but it can only kill by directly attacking people. This snake might release some kind of miasma that infects everyone in a huge radius. Freeing it could infect thousands with Debilify. Nick kept staring at the console. Blitz had said they'd deal with escaping Specters, but he wasn't sure they could handle this one fast enough to avoid mass casualties. He sighed, I'm not going to release this one. His hand moved toward the gadget, but then his face went white, and a terrifying feeling seized him like a humongous snake, covered in eyes, was watching him and squeezing his heart. Nick clutched his chest in pain. He knew what this meant. The Death Pact, he realized in horror. The Death Pact bound Nick to do his best to help Blitz. Freeing the Specter would help them, and by deciding against it, he'd gone against the pact. Fine, I'm freeing it. The moment he made the decision, the grip on his heart loosened, and he could breathe again. After a few seconds, the feeling vanished completely. Nick gritted his teeth. Guess I don't have a choice. I just hope the fallout won't be too disastrous. He fidgeted with the console and set the timer. When he was done, he took a deep breath. The memory of releasing the Crimson Sea surfaced again, and he felt more and more like the incident was about to repeat. Don't think about it. The Death Pact is forcing me into this. It's not my fault this time. Of course, telling himself that did little to ease the guilt. Eventually, Nick pocketed the gadget and cut through the wall into the next locker room. Empty, he thought, checking the console. Next room, empty again. Next room, and again. This is the last room on this side of the hallway. The other containment units must be on the other side. Nick looked at the door leading to the hallway. I can't enter it. It's probably crawling with coral people, and the moment the door opens, the Sea King will know I'm here. He furrowed his brows. The floor above me is the highest one. That's probably where the Sea King is. Ariel Cerulean should be up there too. If I so much as show myself on that floor, I'll die. I can't possibly go up there. After a while, Nick turned around, retraced his path through the destroyed walls, and arrived back in the first locker room. He knocked on the floor. Nothing. He knocked harder. Still nothing. Finally, Nick cut through the floor near the wall and entered the office below again. He stayed there for a while, planning. The Death Pact bound him to do his best to help Blitz. He'd already done a lot, but victory wasn't certain yet. I can't leave this side of the hallway. This floor is filled with specialist offices, and everything below is empty since Anatomy got rid of all their weak Specters. On this side, I've basically done everything I can. At that, the terrifying feeling returned, and Nick gritted his teeth. Really? You're forcing me to do this too, he thought in frustration. This is way too risky. There's a 90% chance I'll die. But the Death Pact didn't care. Nick had to do everything in his power. Fine, I'll do it. The feeling vanished again. Naturally, Nick hadn't done absolutely everything. He, Ghosty, and Vernon had discussed a few more possibilities beforehand, and now was his chance to act on one of them. He took a deep breath and pulled a letter from the black sack. Looking around the paper-strewn office, Nick figured the letter wouldn't be noticed on its own, so he found a knife, set the letter in the middle of the table, and rammed the knife through it. That should be noticeable enough. Next, he cut another opening in the ceiling above the door. Finally, he went to one of the walls. Knock, knock, knock. Nick's ability fluctuated. Someone was in the office beside him. Knock, knock, knock. He knocked again and felt his ability fluctuate once more. Nick transformed into mist and slipped into the new cut he'd made, then waited. A couple of seconds later, the door opened, and a smaller man with dark green hair entered. Nick grew nervous watching him notice the letter on the table. The man looked around the office for a moment, then closed the door behind him, walked over, pulled out the knife, and began reading. As he read, his eyes grew wider and wider. Chapter 483, Ally. Nick watched nervously as the specialist read the letter. After a couple of seconds, he was done and stared into space, considering something. Then he took a deep breath. "Fine, I'm in," he said. "Good choice." The specialist turned around in shock and saw a black figure standing between him and the door. His heart nearly stopped. This person hadn't been here just now. Where had he come from? The sudden appearance terrified him. How strong was this person? "You're the one that wrote this letter?" he asked nervously, holding it up. "No," Nick said. "Ghosty wrote this." The man took a deep breath. "Is it really true? Did Ghosty and Cugelblitz form an alliance to take down Anatomy?" "It's as the letter states," Nick said. "Within 90 minutes the last battle will start, and Anatomy will be destroyed along with everyone loyal to them. However, we all know not all of you are on Anatomy's side. You just never had an opportunity to jump ship. If you're willing to help, you'll survive. You don't even have to fight in the last battle if you don't want to. Standing on the sidelines is already enough," Nick said. The specialist's heart raced. This was a very difficult choice. Choosing wrong meant death. "Who are you?" he asked. "Anatomy has never heard of someone like you." "That's confidential," Nick said. "You can view me as help from outside." From outside? Then the man realized what was going on. This black figure had to be from another city. He took a deep breath. "How will Cugelblitz know I'm not part of Anatomy?" he asked. "First, I need to know if you want to stay neutral in the conflict or join Cugelblitz. Both options are fine with us," Nick said. The man struggled to decide. "I have a family. Will something happen to them?" "No, your choice has no impact on them," Nick answered. The man took a deep breath and stayed silent for 5 seconds. "I don't want to be in this conflict anymore," he said. "For the last few years, I've constantly feared Cugelblitz's assassins. I know they're not the bad ones here, but I don't want to join them. If there's a way to stay neutral, I'd want that." Nick nodded and pulled out the black sack. When the man saw it, he was shocked. "You have a spatial bag?" he asked. "Ghosty is lending me his," Nick said. Spatial bags were extremely valuable treasures. One was worth as much as a demon. Only Aegis could produce them, using the black hole, a humongous specter that grew more powerful by absorbing matter. The black hole was a fallen, a level 7 specter, one of the most powerful humanity had ever managed to contain. There was also one adversary that Aegis had contained. Though that wasn't quite accurate, it had been contained voluntarily, more of a half-ally to Aegis so it could grow stronger. Other than that single specter, Aegis only held a couple of fallen, the black hole among them. Making a spatial bag required working with it, and since the black hole was many kilometers across and grew bigger every time someone worked with it, Aegis avoided doing so unless absolutely necessary. That made spatial bags understandably scarce and valuable. Cugelblitz owned one, and so did Anatomy. The governor did not. Apparently, Ghosty did too, a reward for exemplary scientific service. His inventions were used all over the world. Nick reached into the spatial bag and pulled something out. When the man saw it, he understood. It was a specialist uniform for extractors working at Ghosty's lab. "Does that mean I can work for Ghosty from now on?" he asked. Nick nodded, holding out the uniform. The man thought about Ghosty's lab. Except for its shortage of fanatics, it was basically a dream job. "I'll gladly accept, thank you," he said, taking hold of it. Nick nodded and pulled out a timer, showing it to him. "When this reaches 0, all hell will break loose in here," Nick said. 10 minutes before that, put on the uniform. When it starts, break through the wall and flee to the lower layer. While wearing that uniform, no one should recognize you, just wait until the dust settles." The man looked at the uniform, his hands shaking slightly. "How will I know it started?" "Trust me, you'll notice," Nick said. The man nodded. "The letter said I should help you." "Yes," Nick said. "There are 3 things I need, all but one are harmless." The man grew nervous again. "First, I need to know if there are specialists who hate Anatomy and want to leave. It's imperative they have the guts to actually betray Anatomy." The man thought about it. "There are 2. I've met with them the last couple of weeks. We've talked about an escape plan but never found the opportunity. We were too afraid Cugelblitz would just kill us the moment we fled." Nick nodded. "Can you bring them into the office? They'll receive the same offer as you." "I can try, but it's not easy," the specialist said. "The Sea King's minions are watching us, and if too many of us gather in one place, they might alert it. I can send them in one at a time, 20 minutes apart. That should work." Nick frowned. "Fine, who owns this office?" The man raised an eyebrow, surprised the figure didn't already know. "It's an auxiliary office of Mr. Harrow's," he said. "I only got in by telling the Coral people I heard something in here." No wonder nobody was here, Nick thought. How will you explain to them that 2 other specialists are coming in here? Nick asked. That's my problem, not yours. I'll find a way, he said. Fine, Nick said. Then that's all I need from you. The other 2 tasks are for your friends to make it fair. Nick grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and wrote a long letter. It took a couple of minutes. Hand this to the stronger of the 2, Nick said. I want to meet that person first. The specialist took the letter. Am I allowed to read it? Nick nodded. The specialist read it, then took a deep breath. That's, he said, trailing off. You helped me with one of the tasks, Nick said. You've proven your loyalty. The other 2 still have to. The man took another deep breath. Okay, is there anything else you need? No, your friend will call your second friend. You only need to hand over the letter and wait in your office until it's time. Okay, the man said nervously. Then I'm going now. Nick nodded. The man walked past him toward the door. He turned to say he was leaving, but stopped. He was gone. The black figure had vanished. The man's inside shook, then he left the room. Nick waited in the crack above the door. Several minutes passed. He had to wait 30 minutes. Finally, the door opened. This time 2 people walked in. Okay, so, a black-haired man asked with annoyance. What's so important that we have to talk in here? Well, a red-haired woman said nervously. There was this thing in this place. The door closed behind them. When Nick heard her speak the code phrase, he knew who his ally was. Thing in this place, the man asked with annoyance. Plop. Something landed on top of the black-haired man, and he looked up. Some kind of device he'd never seen before. His barrier flickered, appearing and disappearing. The red-haired woman gritted her teeth, pulled out a gun, pointed it at the man's head, and pulled the trigger.